Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, dear friends, welcome to the 2021 U.S. Brazil Connect Summit. Bem-vindo a todos. I hope you are well and healthy. I am Cássia Carvalho, the Executive Director of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. What a difference a year makes. Today, we come together under very different circumstances and priorities for the U.S.-Brazil relationship. Yet, what remains constant is the business community's engagement and optimism for a stronger U.S.-Brazil economic partnership and the benefits that you would bring for both our nations, for the hemisphere and the world. In today's summit, we will hear from U.S. and Brazilian authorities on a path forward and concrete steps that we collectively, as stakeholders of this relationship, can thrive to achieve and cooperate for rebuilding better post-pandemic. I wish to thank our chair circle companies for their commitment and engagement: Citi, Pfizer, AT&T, and Oecd. Without you, we could not do our work. I wish to recognize our council's chair, Ernesto Torres Cantu, CEO of Citigroup Latin America, and thank Ernesto for his leadership. Now it is my privilege to announce and introduce the council's new vice chair, Carlos Murillo, president of Pfizer Latin America. Pfizer's leadership in the council couldn't be more appropriate and timely, considering the important role that the company is playing in combating the pandemic in the US, Brazil, and of course, globally. Carlos, thank you for taking us on and welcome.
Thanks to you, Cássia, and good afternoon, boa tarde a todos. Thanks, Cássia, for this very kind introduction. It does give me great pleasure to welcome you most cordially at the opening of this meeting. I hope you and your loved ones are safe as well. First of all, I want to share that I'm honored and thrilled to be appointed as Vice Chair of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council. Thank you all for your support and your warm messages. Same as you did, Cássia, I would also like to thank our current chair, Ernesto Torres Cantu, for his leadership, and welcome Joberto Azevedo as the new chair. It will be a pleasure to start working with you next year. This council has been instrumental in developing a strong relationship between companies, the United States, and the Brazilian government, and growing the bilateral relationship between the two countries. And it's the premier organization for engaging with both governments. I think we all know the strong U.S.-Brazil alliance and dialogue are essential to promote an inclusive economic growth. In this new role, I intend to work with all of you to expand our collaborative opportunities. The pandemic has made evident that this is the only possible way to face current and future challenges. Brazil-U.S. Business Council is a great example of team effort and work. Additionally, as Pfizer regional president, I cannot be prouder of how Pfizer and many other companies represented by many of you here have stepped up during these pandemic times, taking care of our employees, keeping our businesses at a sustainable level, partnering with government and other stakeholders, and ensuring of doing everything we could in our hands to help mitigate the consequences of this tough moment. At Pfizer, from day one, I believe, we have worked relentlessly to leverage our decades of experience and expertise in development, testing, manufacturing, and distribution, along with our partnerships to provide a safe and effective vaccine for all. As of last week, globally, we have delivered more than 1.8 billion vaccines to 146 countries and territories in every region of the world, including more than 115 million doses to Brazil. Another 85 million doses will be delivered to the country this year, totaling 200 million, which can benefit almost half of the country's populations. It's clear how much more Pfizer has become known for our COVID vaccine. But the truth is we have a long history of innovation and we change the way we treat many diseases. And as a leader in the pharmaceutical industry, I can assure you that improving healthcare is key to have a sustainable society. We also believe that this pandemic has also reinforced the important role trade plays, not only in ensuring access to vaccine, but mostly in building resilient supply chains and healthier economies. The Brazil-U.S. Business Council has played a key role in making sure both governments understand the need for open and transparent supply chains and ensuring that trade rules support innovation. We have many lessons learned from some challenging times. At Brazil-U.S. Business Council, we can certainly leverage all those learnings and join forces to contribute to address future opportunities. Finally, I want to take this chance to recognize the work of Brazilian health authorities and authorities during such difficult times and reinforce the commitment of this council in the fight against this pandemic, as well as to continue forge a strong economic ties. Hope you all enjoyed today's event. Thank you very much, Cassia.
Thank you so much, Murilo. And thank you again for taking us on, and I look forward to our very productive partnership. Distinguished guests, to kick off our summit, I am delighted to welcome back to the U.S. Brazil Connect Summit, President Jair Bolsonaro of the Federative Republic of Brazil for opening remarks.
Senhor Vice-Presidente Executivo da Câmara de Comércio dos Estados Unidos, Myron Brilliam, Senhora Diretora Executiva do Conselho Empresarial Brasil e Estados Unidos, Cássia Carvalho, Senhoras e senhores, bom dia a todos. É um prazer dirigir-me novamente ao Conselho Empresarial Brasil e Estados Unidos, integrado por brasileiros e americanos empreendedores, trabalhadores, entusiastas de um futuro próspero para as nossas nações. A prioridade que o Brasil confere ao relacionamento com os Estados Unidos é de conhecimento de todos, como atestam as viagens oficiais que realizei a esse grande país irmão. A parceria histórica do Brasil com os Estados Unidos tem fundação sólida, baseada na convergência de valores e na busca incessante do bem-estar do nosso povo. Somos as duas maiores democracias das Américas e sei que iremos mais longe se caminharmos lado a lado. Somos também pragmáticos e buscamos os benefícios mútuos da nossa cooperação em setores estratégicos. Queremos fortalecer nossos laços com o governo norte-americano, em particular na promoção de mais comércio e investimentos de lado a lado, temas caros a este Conselho. Nossas economias são complementares em diversos aspectos. O Brasil exporta aos Estados Unidos desde produtos básicos até bens industriais avançados, de café a aeronaves. Com nenhuma outra nação desenvolvida, mantemos uma relação comercial tão diversa e multifacetada. A maturidade da relação bilateral reflete-se na ampliação do nosso arcabouço jurídico nos últimos anos, por meio da assinatura de acordos nas mais diversas áreas, como, por exemplo, facilitação do comércio, boas práticas regulatórias, combate à corrupção, regras comerciais e de transparência, participação dos Estados Unidos em lançamentos a partir do Centro Espacial de Alcântara e cooperação em defesa. Adicionalmente, está sob negociação um acordo de incentivo ao investimento, que atualizará o Acordo de Garantia de Investimentos de 1965. Cada entendimento e cada atualização constitui um passo adicional no fortalecimento de nossa relação. A economia brasileira deve crescer até 5% em 2021. Estamos claramente em um processo de retomada do crescimento no período pós-pandemia, que já se inicia aos poucos. Esse crescimento gera oportunidades para os empreendedores deste Conselho e para a comunidade empresarial como um todo. Como tenho sublinhado, Desde o início do meu governo, em meus contatos com autoridades norte-americanas, o Brasil conta com o maior programa de parceria e investimentos de sua história. Este programa encontra-se em pleno ritmo de execução. Desde 2019, o PPI realizou 113 leilões, com 22 bilhões de dólares em outorgas e 100 bilhões de dólares em expectativa de investimentos. A carteira atual do PPI compreende 190 projetos nos setores estratégicos da economia brasileira. Em 2021, já concluímos 48 leilões. Entre os projetos em andamento, destacam-se a privatização da Eletrobras, dos Correios, o leilão de radiofrequências 5G e as concessões para gestão e uso sustentável de parques nacionais. Nossa infraestrutura energética é uma das mais limpas do mundo, como não me canso de enfatizar. Utilizamos energia renovável vinda das águas, por meio de hidrelétricas que respondem por 65% de nossa matriz energética. A importância da energia dos ventos, com as centrais eólicas ultrapassando 10% de nossa matriz. A relevância da energia solar em franca expansão no país. O protagonismo nos transportes da energia das plantas, com etanol de cana-de-açúcar movimentando praticamente toda a nossa frota de carros de passeio, com motores híbridos combinados a outras fontes. O uso de biodiesel por nossos caminhoneiros, os maiores responsáveis pelo nosso transporte doméstico de mercadorias. Nossa posição na dianteira da pesquisa de fontes renováveis de energia. Temos desafios a superar, como a estiagem prolongada deste ano e seus reflexos negativos sobre a produção das hidrelétricas. Mas, diante de tantos exemplos positivos que acabo de citar, estou confiante de estarmos no caminho certo. O Brasil tem consciência de que uma economia saudável depende de um meio ambiente protegido. Não há prosperidade sem desenvolvimento sustentável. O agronegócio brasileiro é produtivo e competitivo, com preocupação em investimentos crescentes em sustentabilidade. Nossa moderna agropecuária de baixo carbono alimenta mais de 1 bilhão de pessoas em todo o mundo, utilizando tão somente 8% do território nacional. Nosso Código Florestal é exemplar, com exigência de preservação de vegetações nativas em todos os biomas brasileiros, mesmo em propriedades rurais privadas. Nenhum país do mundo possui legislação ambiental tão avançada. Em matéria de resultados, o Brasil tem muito a apresentar. Segundo dados preliminares do Instituto Nacional de Pesquisas Espaciais, o desmatamento na Amazônia brasileira entre agosto de 2020 e julho de 2021 regrediu cerca de 5% em relação ao período anterior. Se considerarmos o último mês de agosto, a queda é bastante significativa, 32% em relação a agosto do ano passado. Os incêndios florestais também diminuíram, com redução de cerca de 30% nos focos de queimadas entre janeiro e setembro de 2021, em relação ao mesmo período de 2020. As dimensões continentais do Brasil implicam desafios igualmente continentais, sem esmorecermos em nosso compromisso de enfrentá-los. Na esfera multilateral, permanecemos engajados e antecipamos voluntariamente de 2060 para 2050 a meta de alcançar a neutralidade climática. Estabeleci compromisso de dobrar os recursos humanos e financeiros destinados pelo governo federal aos órgãos ambientais, com o objetivo de zerar o desmatamento ilegal até 2030. Mantemos nosso compromisso com os princípios que prestigiamos desde a Rio 92. As responsabilidades permanecem comuns, mas também diferenciadas. No âmbito do Acordo de Paris, ao qual os Estados Unidos se reintegraram neste ano, o Brasil defende a real implementação dos mercados de carbono, como fonte de recursos para investimentos em domínios da economia verde, como o florestal, o industrial, a geração de energia e o manejo de resíduos. Trabalharemos na COP26, que se aproxima em novembro, por esse resultado. Antes de concluir, gostaria de tecer alguns comentários sobre a cooperação do Brasil com a Oecd, a qual remonta à década de 90. Como os senhores sabem, o Brasil formalizou sua candidatura a membro pleno da organização em 2017 e é hoje o único país que se enquadra simultaneamente nas categorias de parceiro-chave e membro em potencial. O Brasil já aderiu a 100 dos 247 acordos que compõem a OCDE. Dezenas de outros acordos estão sob análise, muitos dos quais na área ambiental. Somos o país não membro com o maior grau de alinhamento às normas da organização. Nos nossos contatos com as autoridades norte-americanas, temos ressaltado a relevância do apoio dos Estados Unidos para que se inicie o quanto antes o processo de acessão do Brasil à OCDE. Conto também com o apoio dos senhores do setor privado norte-americano para que o pleito brasileiro seja bem sucedido. Estou certo de que a entrada do Brasil na organização contribuirá para o ambiente de negócios e investimentos entre nossos países. Em conclusão, o Brasil de hoje está pronto para o futuro e pronto para consolidar ainda mais a relação estratégica que mantemos com os Estados Unidos. Convido os empresários que nos assistem a visitarem o Brasil, a conhecerem com seus próprios olhos a riqueza, a diversidade e a complexidade de nosso país. Desejo a todos um produtivo evento e bons negócios. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'll have the honor to introduce the next session. So good afternoon, everyone, again. It's an honor for me to introduce this session in which we'll further explore the importance of a strong U.S. Brazil alliance to promote an inclusive economic growth. We will now have the chance to have this roundtable with Nestor Foster, Brazilian ambassador to the U.S., and Douglas Conniff, apologies if I'm not pronouncing your names correctly, U.S. Charge d'Affaires, the U.S. mission to Brazil. I believe Ambassador Foster is well known by all of us. He's a career diplomat and a longtime friend of the Chamber and the Council. He's from Rio Grande do Sul, the southernmost state in Brazil. Beautiful region, I might say. And he served in various posts in the Americas region, including Costa Rica, Canada, and in several places in the United States. His diplomatic experience is vast, including trade negotiations, IP, financial policy, political affairs, international law, among others. Ambassador Foster was also very active during pandemic, supporting Brazil's efforts to fight COVID-19. I can give testimony to that. He was an important ally of us and a bridge with the Brazilian government as we were negotiating our vaccine introduction in the country. I also would like to introduce Mr. Doug Conniff. Prior to his current assignment as Deputy Chief of Mission, Mr. Conniff was the Office Director for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, Brazil and Southern Cone. He also served in various posts in countries like Ecuador, Mexico, and his overseas assignments include U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia, and Santiago, Chile, a country that's also very dear to my heart since I lived there for some years. Similarly, Mr. Conniff was also a valuable and much appreciated partner on this process to fight COVID-19 and our relations with the government of Brazil. We're very appreciative of Ambassador Foster and Mr. Conniff's time today. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ambassador Foster for his opening remarks. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Carlos Murillo. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for the Chamber for organizing this event. Let me just begin by congratulating you, Carlos Murillo, and Joberto Azevedo for the announcement that you'll be leading the U.S. Brazil Business Council. We are amazed by the caliber of the indications and the leadership that you bring to the U.S. Council, Brazil Business Council at this juncture. So thank you for that, and congratulations. It's great to be here with my good friend Doug Kenneth again. Let me start. I think it would be appropriate to start by highlighting the recovery that's going on in Brazil, with a projected GDP growth this year of over 5%, and thanks in no small part to the great effort that was undertaken by the Brazilian government, by the Brazilian society, by the private sector in vaccinating our population. And I want to expressly thank Pfizer for the role you played in this, and the other companies, and other members of the chamber and of the council who have helped us, and also the U.S. government, who has donated already 3 million vaccines. There are apparently 2 million more to come very shortly. So that's a tremendous effort. That has produced great results on the ground, as you know. Brazil at this point, in terms of our adult population, we have 95% of the population have received at least one shot, and 70% is fully vaccinated. So that's really amazing, considering that we started a bit late because of the the number of vaccines available. And I remember hearing from Minister of Health Quiroga that his goal, his dream, would be to vaccinate 1.4 million Brazilians a day. We've been doing over 3 million. Actually, in the past week, Brazil has been the country in the world who has vaccinated most of its population. And this is bringing the numbers down, the cases down, the fatalities down, and so on. And it's enabling us to pick up, the economy is picking up again, job generation, and so on. So that's really something good to report. And I thank all those involved in this effort, including our friends at the U.S. Embassy in Brasilia, who played a great role in all this effort. Let me highlight other things that are going on, which merit a mention here in this forum. One of them is that, by coincidence, just yesterday, we had our lower house, our Chamber of Deputies, finally approving the three trade protocols that we signed a year ago on business facilitation, good regulatory practice, anti-corruption measures. It will go now to the Senate, and we expect that this will be in force by the end of this year. So this is again great news. Another sign of the recovery that's going on is the data on bilateral trade. We suffered a little bit on our bilateral trade with the United States during the pandemic last year. It was a drop of around 25% in our exports, because what we export to the U.S. has to do with some of the sectors that were mostly hardest hit by the pandemic, transportation, machinery, equipment, etc., aircrafts. But that has picked up this year tremendously. And in the first 9 months of this year of 2021, we have a bilateral trade that has stopped $50 billion. And according to estimates of the American Chamber, this should be a record year. We should break a record in terms of the volume of our bilateral trade, signaling, tremendous potential that we need to do more to bring to fruition, I'd say. But there's, lots more going on, specifically in the bilateral agenda. We've been working with the Biden administration, of course, on environmental matters, a priority for both our countries. We have COP beginning just, next week. We have engaged with the Biden administration, the Special Envoy, John Kerry, from the very outset of this new administration here in the U.S. There's been a continuous and very fruitful dialogue trying to address things that Brazil and the U.S. can do together, both at the bilateral level, especially addressing some of the challenges that we have in Brazil in terms of deforestation, for instance, and but also looking at the bigger picture and what we can do to address the climate challenges in COP26 and beyond. And I'll be happy to provide you with more details on that in our conversation. I just want to highlight that the level of commitment that Brazil is bringing to the table, and you heard it from the president himself in his address just a few minutes ago. Brazil was one of the first developing countries to commit to 2050 to complete the energy transition. The president committed to doubling our enforcement budget. That was back at the leaders' meeting in late April. Just a month later, he fulfilled that commitment. We have an increase in our budget enforcement for to fight environmental crimes in the Amazon and other parts of Brazil of 118% to be precise. We also had a significant increase in the amount of people allocated to fighting illegal activities in the Amazon, deforestation, illegal mining, and so on. Aside from that, we have new areas which promise a lot for our relationship, including in terms of trade and investment opportunities. Just want to highlight briefly that, not to take too much time, so on top of what we're doing on the environment, we have Brazil joining the Artemis space exploration project, the most ambitious space exploration project anywhere in the world. Currently, Brazil was the first Latin American country to join it. We see that as opening up tremendous opportunities for new investment, new partnerships, for technology transfer and opportunities in this very, very vital sector for the future. We also have a tradition and ongoing cooperation on defense matters. It's a broad dialogue that's been going on for a very long time and keeps improving and getting better. We have a significant new effort on energy with the U.S. Brazil Energy Forum. We are addressing, of course, this is connected also to the environmental agenda, where we're working together on renewable fuels, for instance, on sustainable aviation fuels for the aviation sector. We are doing great things there, and we invite the private sector to join us in all that. On top of that, we have a very vibrant, dialogue on the political level. We're cooperating now that Brazil is a temporary member of the Security Council at the United Nations. We have an organized dialogue for that. And we have a very broad institutional framework, as you know. Back to our trade and investment economic issues here. We have the CEO Forum coming up this February. We have the commercial dialogue in just a few weeks, which should address questions of great interest in regulatory matters and standards for both our countries. I just would like to wrap up my opening remarks, just highlighting one point. I think that this tremendous resurgence of our bilateral trade, if I can use that word, comparing with the previous year, shows enormous potential. And I think we should take this opportunity and try to do more. If political circumstances eventually do not warrant a broad, deep free trade agreement, we would be ready to address sectoral agreements, partial agreements, but we should continue to move forward, building on what we have done up to now. And we really appreciate the support that has been provided by the Council and the Chamber in our efforts. I mentioned the 3 agreements that have been just approved by the lower chamber in Brazil. And we look forward to continue with this partnership and doing much more in the months and years to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Mr. Ambassador Forster. Thank you for this very clear initial remarks. So now we will turn, please, to the U.S. Church Affairs, Douglas Conniff. So Mr. Conniff, please, your perspective on the U.S. Brazil relations. Thank you.
Carlos, thanks so much for the warm introduction. I'm very pleased to be here with my good friend, Ambassador Nestor Forster, Brazil's ambassador to the U.S., an incredibly accomplished diplomat, as you noted, and a wonderful representative of his government. Nestor, you'll be happy to know I've gone to Rio Grande do Sul so much that I've stopped drinking coffee and now I'm drinking chimarrão. Oh. So we'll see how long that lasts, but I'm really enjoying it. But I'd also like to thank the Brazil-U.S. Business Council for organizing this event. Carlos, thank you. Cassio, it's wonderful to work together with you and all of our corporate participants attending the summit. It's great to see such a high level of interest and enthusiasm present here today, and I welcome this opportunity provided by the BUSBC to discuss how the United States and Brazil can continue to expand our economic relationship. I'm also looking forward to hearing the other discussions that'll be taking place this afternoon, and I just want to commend you all for a very impressive lineup of speakers that you have here today. The United States and Brazil are natural economic partners, and we're excited about the opportunities we're currently developing. Ambassador Forster talked about a number of those, as well as the additional opportunities that we can create together. As the 2 largest democracies in this hemisphere, the U.S.-Brazil relationship is among our most significant partnerships, and we enjoy many shared priorities. In spite of the difficulties created by this pandemic, we've affirmed the significance of this partnership in recent months through various types of high-level engagement between our 2 governments. In August, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan chose Brazil as the first country he would visit in an official capacity overseas because of the importance of the relationship. And his discussions on the visit reaffirmed the strategic alliance between the United States and Brazil. Also recently, Assistant USTR Daniel Watson's visit to Brazil, also in August, was part of the first trip to South America by USTR under the Biden administration, and also signified the importance of this relationship. The discussions during the visit were key in establishing priorities for our economic and trade engagement. But in addition to that, we've had other senior level visits as well, including not too long ago, a visit by Commander of Southern Command, Admiral Craig Fowler, who chose Brasilia and Rio to be his very last foreign visits as Southcom. So the United States is committed to the continued efforts to reduce barriers to trade and investment between our two countries. In 2020, we updated our bilateral agreement on trade and economic cooperation, or ATEC, with protocol on trade rules and transparency. As Ambassador Forster mentioned, the ATEC protocols were approved in the lower chamber yesterday and have moved on to the Senate, where in our conversations here, we've been assured that they will have a quick passage. An efficient and a complete ATEC implementation will signal to the private sector and other stakeholders that both countries are committed to facilitating the process of doing business and establishing high standard rules for trade. Our bilateral trade in goods and services was over $100 billion in 2018 and 19, and is forecast by AmCham Brazil to reach a record in 2021, following the negative impact of COVID-19 last year. And the full implementation of the ATEC protocol will help to even further accelerate our future bilateral trade. The United States is by far the largest source of foreign direct investment in Brazil, with the Brazilian Central Bank counting a total of $145 billion in cumulative U.S. investment as of 2019. This compares with about $27 billion from China. So more than with any other nation, U.S. companies have invested tremendously in Brazil. They realize that partnering with Brazilian firms is smart business for both sides, and that by working together, they can provide the best options to meet the needs of customers in Brazil and around the region. In fact, nearly every Brazilian has been employed by, benefited from, or regularly uses high-quality products or services created together by U.S. and Brazilian partners. We applaud the government of Brazil's efforts to align with the economic, political, and governance commitments of the OECD. At a bilateral meeting earlier this month, again, National Security Advisor Sullivan reiterated to his counterpart U.S. support for Brazil's accession to the OECD. We agree with Brazilian leaders that OECD accession and full adoption of OECD norms and instruments will be good for Brazil and good for its partners. Brazilian leadership on environmental issues and climate discussions is critical to effectively tackling our shared global challenges. International attention on tackling climate change has never been greater, and financing the move to net zero carbon emissions is one of the most pressing challenges that we face today. Here at the embassy, we're working with our counterparts, diplomatic, civil society, private sector, to work with Brazil to deliver on commitments that were made by President Bolsonaro at the Leaders' Summit on Climate this past April, ending illegal deforestation by 2030, achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and doubling environmental enforcement resources. And let me be clear, we all have to do our part, all of us, all countries around the world, including the United States, to meet the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Climate change is an existential threat to the world, as we have heard from Special Envoy Kerry on many occasions. Meeting these top-line commitments is a multi-layered and complex process. Government action is necessary, but by no means sufficient on its own. It will rely so much more on outside government, which is where we've begun to see momentum increase in recent years. And I want to thank BUSBC for your role in this. Global investors and consumers are now paying more attention than ever to the impact of illegal deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and emissions reductions. They're looking for ways to encourage sustainable business practices by our largest corporations. They're looking to local expertise and indigenous knowledge for the most effective ways to conserve natural resources and create economic activity. In Brazil, the U.S. mission is doing its part to help support and develop these activities in many ways, including through USAID mobilizing Amazon Finance through its Partnership Platform for the Americas, PPA, through meeting with Brazilian financial firms developing innovative instruments to support carbon absorption and emissions reductions, and through other initiatives. The challenge that we face in this area are clear, and they're not insignificant, but they are surmountable. Challenges stimulate innovation, and innovation brings opportunity. And there's a lot more that we can do. Supply chains is a prime example. The US and Brazil have a common interest in developing reliable supply chains in this hemisphere in a number of key areas, ranging from vaccines and API, semiconductor chips, critical minerals, to things like green hydrogen and EV batteries. These discussions are in various phases of development, but it's clear that reliable supply chains in this hemisphere are of bilateral interest and regional interest. So we look forward to continuing down the path of increased cooperation and friendship. The relationship between the United States and Brazil is strong and very important, and it's only going to strengthen in the future. So thank you for your time, and now I will pass the word back to Carlos. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Mr. Carniff. And now we'll move to a Q&A session, though it's going to be moderated, led by Kasia. So Kasia, to you.
Oh, thank you, Carlos, and thank you both, Ambassador Nestor and Chargé Doug. Thank you again for being here with us today. I want to go back to the economic and trade agenda. You both referred to it, the increase in the past year, which is a testament of the strong economic relationship and the potential of the relationship. And us, the private sector, of course, we call for a very ambitious economic agenda. We hope that one day soon, Brazil and the US will have a trade agreement in addition to a bilateral tax treaty that would benefit both US and Brazilian companies investing and doing business in both our countries. So let's talk about the economic agenda and some of the upcoming meetings. What exactly is on the agenda in the short term, and how can we expect to make concrete progress on the economic agenda, and how can we, the Brazil-US Business Council, help to move this agenda forward? Ambassador? Yes.
Well, thank you, Kasia. Thank you. I think that's just, you put your finger right on the spot. That's the crucial issue that remains a big challenge in our bilateral relations, is to have a clear vision of where do we want to go in trade, in economic issues, investment issues, and so on. In the short term, as I mentioned, we have the commercial dialogue, which is going to take place shortly. That's something very important, more important than it sounds. It's not a bunch of bureaucrats getting together. It's key agencies on both sides discussing standards, how to harmonize standards, including for some key sectors of the economy, like the automotive. We had a great meeting last year. We should continue to build upon that success this year. So that's something to look forward to, within its own scope. But what we need to do is that the larger picture. And the larger picture, I think would call for some reflection on how we can build upon what we have achieved, with the agreements that the ATEC, the Agreement on Trade and Economic Cooperation, that have been approved by the Chamber in Brazil yesterday. How can we continue on that path towards, completing the framework for our bilateral trade relation? That goes a long way before we can, engage directly in market access issues. But on market access issues, there remain a couple of issues that, it's important to raise, and the industry in Brazil is concerned. One of them, and that's on the more we are demanding, let's say, is we'd like to see an end to the so-called Section 232 restrictions on our steel and aluminum exports to the United States. We see that it's something that's hurting the American consumer and the American industry, and is killing jobs in this country, not generating any jobs. because of the level of integration and because 90% of the steel we export to the United States is semi-manufactured. So just to give one concrete example, we know there are ongoing talks between the USTR and our European friends. It's only between them so far. We'd like to see Brazil be invited to join those discussions and, see how we can open up, because of course, Brazil is not part of the problem in terms of the, oversupply of steel, et cetera. But beyond that, I think we should look, we talked a lot about supply chain, and there's a lot of convergence and common interest in that area, in different key areas, healthcare products, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, batteries, et cetera, semiconductors. And there's tremendous interest on both sides, and we should continue to progress on that. There's one thing that we have made great progress, and I don't want to anticipate anything, but we are approaching the end of our very long discussion on the global entry. It's not directly, related to the economy, but it affects the way people travel between our countries, and that will be very much welcome news. We'll continue to work on that. Looking beyond that, there's a key sector for both our countries, which is the agriculture, the agribusiness sector. And there's tremendous room for cooperation there and continue to promote science-based sustainable agriculture, around the world in different markets and including in the WTO. I also think there's a tremendous room for joint cooperative work and WTO reform in terms of, the many shortcomings that we know exist there in the dispute settlement mechanism, and, addressing the whole question of agricultural subsidies, industrial subsidies, fishing subsidies, et cetera, that are on the agenda. I think there's lots of room to work together. But you see, I mentioned piecemeal things. We are lacking a framework to do that, looking forward. And the point I make about that is that, if the U.S. is concerned about competition from third countries in Latin America, it should, perhaps be more aggressive about its economic and trade presence there.
Thank you, Ambassador Nestor. Charge, Doug.
Nestor talked about a number of things. Just to add, I would just flag that Assistant USTR Daniel Watson's visit to Brazil, one of the first countries that he visited in the Western Hemisphere, is a strong signal of our commitment to advancing this economic relationship. His discussions during the trip were really essential in helping both sides develop priorities and agenda for future trade and economic engagement. So the key next step really is full ratification of ATEC, and then its successful implementation. After that, I think we're looking at additional protocols. What would be those additional protocols that we should discuss and seek to sign? I know the private sector is tracking this as well. One thing that I really want to mention is just the green component to our trade and investment agenda. I think this is something that is increasingly on everyone's mind. Investors want to know, and not just in Brazil, but in the United States and other countries around the world, they want to know where their money's going and whether their money is contributing to helping the environment or if it's hurting the environment. Words that I have not heard before, like traceability, is now something that we talk about every day. And so I think Brazil understands and appreciates this, that the way forward to increase foreign direct investment, to create trade and investment from the United States and Brazil, is really to adopt this green agenda, not just for green's sake, but because it's in our best long-term interest, and also it can be channeled directly into sustainable development, bioeconomy. These are ways to improve the lives of people in parts of the country that have not had that opportunity. It's really a win-win. And so the degree to which we can adopt a green framework in our approach to trade and investment, I think that's going to open up more opportunities for both countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Charge. I see a number of questions coming in, but I will quickly follow up on what you both said still on the trade and economic relationship. As you both know, the Council, along with our institutional partners, CNI, a few years ago, we launched a roadmap to a trade agreement, as well as a roadmap to a bilateral tax treaty. I believe that roadmap is still very much valid. And that does provide this framework for both countries to advance on the trade negotiations towards a trade agreement. So my question is, can we expect an ATAC meeting anytime soon or in the coming months?
Yes. Well, I think there was talk of that when Mr. Watson visited us last August. I didn't see a date being defined, and I think we would go a long way if we could, try to identify what Doug just mentioned, what the next steps would be within ATAC, what other protocols we could do. Perhaps that would be very helpful. Another thing, I think, Cassia, when you ask, what the council, how can the council support this ambitious agenda? I totally agree with you that the roadmap to a trade agreement remains, mostly valid in many aspects. And I think we should continue to do what we're doing to talk to our friends on the Hill and on the administration and try to show to them that the enormous potential that remains untapped in our bilateral trade and economic agenda, even though, the U.S. has this fantastic presence in terms of FDI in Brazil that Doug alluded to, having 5 times the amount of FDI that China has in Brazil so far. But that should not make us just rest on our laurels. There's more to be done, and Chinese and other countries' investments are growing by leaps and bounds, and we'd like to see the U.S. keeping pace with that growth.
The only thing I would add really is I wish that Daniel Watson were on the line with us. I had a chance to speak with him recently. I know that these are things that they're discussing, and then we'll raise with the Brazilian government of what is good timing for our next ATEC meetings. And so these discussions are going on, and I think we all agree that looking at additional protocols, even if we're not looking at a comprehensive FTA right now, we do want to focus on are there additional protocols that we can work together on.
Very good. Well, thank you. We understand there will be steps forward, not a complete trade agreement. I want to go to the issue of environment and climate, so important as you both highlighted. President Bolsonaro just restated Brazil's climate commitments, carbon neutrality by 2050, zero illegal deforestation by 2030, and also resources for the institutions. Is Brazil on the right path? Nestor, that's the question for you. And I noticed just this week, actually, President Bolsonaro and the Brazilian government launched the Green Growth Initiative. Can you share with us more about this Green Growth Initiative, and does that put Brazil on the right path to achieving its climate commitments?
Thank you so much for that question, Cassia. I wanted to talk about that. Let me just in a broad way before I address the Green Growth Initiative. We at the levels of the commitments are there. We have been following through with our commitments. We don't want just empty commitments. We want action. The action is taking place and is producing results. It will take a while to change some of the more hostile headlines, but I invite everyone that's with us here today to take a fresh look at what's going on in Brazil and look at the numbers, look at the data. We're not here to make big speeches. We're here to talk about reality. So in terms of deforestation, which remains the crucial challenge that's been acknowledged, we are working hard for it in several fronts. Reinforcing budgets, hiring more personnel, engaging armed forces in fighting illegal activities, and bringing the private sector in and making all these commitments for energy transition. I just want to highlight in terms of deforestation that if we take the 4 months of the dry season, beginning in June through September, okay? So I'm not talking about an isolated month, and there are some good ones on recent record, but talking about the 4 months accumulated for the dry season, June through September, we had a reduction this year, 2021, of 11% of deforestation over the previous year, over 2020. If we compare with 2019, it's almost 30%, 4 months, 4 drier months, which are usually the months where most of the deforestation takes place for obvious reasons. So, the results are there. I'm tired of reading that, that nothing is happening. We have things happening, and they are very good things, but there's more than that. There's a renewed commitment, and this, I think this, the initiative of the Green Growth highlights that. The Green Growth Initiative basically is a way to, bring together all investment projects of the administration, the PPI, whatever is envisaged in terms of infrastructure projects and so on, and putting them in a let's say in a green path, and prioritizing those who are better for the environment, okay, and taking out of the table those which are not. That's the simplest way to put it. It comes with $80 billion, over 400 billion reais are involved in this project. So that highlights not only commitment, but serious action on this crucial matter. But let me highlight just one more thing, Accession, if I may. We've been working, I said, along with the Special Envoy Kerry, we just met over the weekend. We're going to meet again, perhaps before COP, our Minister of the Environment, Minister Leite. And there's been a great partnership between our Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of the Environment with the new leadership there. And one thing we've done is the minister has spoken with over 60 ministers of the environment of different 60 countries in the past month and a half, highlighting the importance of the commitments to COP and offering help from Brazil in areas where Brazil can help. For instance, questions of access to water, of basic sanitation, of renewable energies, And one big thing we're trying to do is to create a world market for ethanol. I think it's unrealistic to suppose that we are going to go from fossil fuels all the way to electric cars that are powered by electricity that's been environmentally sustainably generated. There's going to be some transition. Ethanol will play a crucial role in that. In African countries, in Asian countries, India has a great partnership with Brazil already. We are not interested in selling more ethanol. This is not about it. It's about creating a worldwide market that will make a difference for climate change.
Thank you, Ambassador Nestor. Jorge Doug, I would like to give you the opportunity to mention how can the U.S. support Brazil in its climate adaptation and transition, especially with financial resources or with technical preparedness for projects that are so needed for the transition, for the climate transition.
Sure. Thanks, Cassia. First, let me say, and I agree with so much of what Nestor said. What we're looking for in COP26, not just of Brazil, but of all countries, are raising those ambitions. And so what are Brazil's ambitions? To achieve net zero carbon by 2050, zero illegal deforestation by 2030, doubling the budget on enforcement. And signs are that they are doing these things. They're going to announce these things. I would respectfully suggest that there's going to be a lot of voices at COP, and I would suggest that those sorts of announcements come out earlier rather than later, before COP, where they can have more of an impact instead of when every country is talking at COP. That's just my opinion. But also other things, such as signing on to the Global Methane Pledge, which is not a bilateral, it's a collective agreement among many countries to reduce global methane by 30% by 2030. Sign on to the Glasgow Declaration on Forest Preservation, contribute to a solution to Article 6. These are ways that I think, ways that Brazil can and I hope will make for a very successful COP26 for all of us. I had a chance to speak with Special Envoy Kerry last week. He did a virtual chat with chiefs of mission across the world, and I took advantage of it to simply ask him what success for Brazil looked like to him. And he was very clear. He said with every country he thinks of something differently, including the United States. But with Brazil, it really comes to deforestation. And I know from Special Envoy Kerry's point of view, he really hopes to see an implementation plan with real teeth in it that will create a trend to zero illegal deforestation by 2030. I know that Brazil's working hard on a plan. We have regular conversations, and we look forward to that being announced. In terms of what the U.S. can do to support Brazil, as many of you know, we've been working together closely for many, many years. We have incredible programs in Brazil through USAID and others. We have ongoing things that we do. We have future things that we wish to do. But we have a lot of key efforts in Brazil, including support through the DFC to support financing for businesses and entrepreneurs. AID with programs that promote economic livelihood and poverty reduction in some of the poorest communities in Brazil. We're looking at a DFC loan to a major bank of $45 million over 5 years. That'll expand lending to small and medium enterprises in the legal Amazon in Brazil. And new deals under the Amazon Biodiversity Fund, the ABF, are being made toward the goal of investing 300 million reais in 20 to 25 venture and early growth deals for nature-based, biodiversity-friendly projects over the next 9 years. So that's just the start. We're also looking at more technical assistance in fire management, training. And so as the Biden administration looks to invest billions around the world in the coming years, along with other developed countries around the world, to address climate adaptation and transition, we recognize that we have a responsibility to poor and marginalized communities who are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And so this is just a few of the ways that we are working and will continue to work together with Brazil.
Very good. Thank you for those comments. We have 2 questions here on the Q&A related to still environment. I believe one of them, what does COP26 success look like for both countries? I think we've answered most of that, unless Ambassador Nestor has more to add on what COP26 success looks like for Brazil's perspective.
If I can add just
yes.
quickly, you know, of course, we would like to see, you know, we turning the page on Article 6 and having the carbon market, you know, with the rules for the carbon market agreed to, and, you know, both on 6.2 and 6.4, you know, we think that that would go a long way and enable a country like Brazil, which has preserved some 66.3% is the latest data from Embrapa, from the Brazilian agricultural research company, confirmed by NASA satellites. 66.3% of Brazilian territory still has its original vegetation. Very few countries can boast of that in the world, if any. Of those, 84% is the original Amazon still standing. So in terms of success of COP, Article 6 is one thing. Of course, the commitments made by developed nations, you know, in terms of climate finance and assisting the energy transition effort, that's absolutely crucial. And we, you know, we don't talk too much about that, and we need to go back to that. You know, that's the very foundation of everything we've been doing on the environment since Rio 92. You know, the whole concept of sustainable development, its foundation was the common but differentiated responsibilities. And, you know, developing countries are not the worst pollutants historically. You know, we cannot foot the bill alone. And today we had a briefing by Special Envoy Kerry to heads of mission here in Washington. And he was highlighting that, you know, the expectation that countries will, you know, move straight forward to greener industries and so on. Of course, that comes with a price tag, and we need developed nations to do their part. So that will be the part, a crucial aspect of the success of COP is developed nations fulfilling their commitments.
Thank you, Ambassador Nestor. As you know, we also believe that the private sector plays a very important role. One, in the financing, ESG and climate financing, and 2, in finding the technology, innovative solutions, right? And the Council, we have been a platform for those discussions, as you know, with Secretary Kerry, but also with funds and investors playing a key role in this investment transition. One question still here on the Q&A that I would like to ask is the U.S. Brazil Environmental Framework Dialogue that was established a year ago. Is that the place for all of these dialogues taking place? And how can we, the private sector, be part of that and supportive of that dialogue?
Doug, you want to talk? Let me talk first.
I'll just say, and I was there. I was at the event here in Brasilia last year when we signed on to that. And let me just say, I think things become overcome by events a little bit. We had elections. We had this really strong push by the Biden administration on climate change, and that really kind of took on its own steam. And I think we've done much more than we probably would have done under a framework, just in a very bilateral, multilateral way to engage on the environment. I mean, we talk constantly about the environment. We've been doing it really since late January. What I would expect, Cassia, is that after COP26, there's the very important question of what next? How do we keep the momentum going? What are we going to do? And that's where I see that the environmental framework can be a very useful tool for us to follow up on specific things once we get past COP26. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
If I can comment on that, because I couldn't agree more. And I subscribe to everything that Doug said. And we need the private sector on board. There, it has a crucial role to play in both in terms of finance, but in the case of Brazil, also in terms of conservation. That data I mentioned, the 66.3% of natural cover of the country, natural vegetation being preserved. That's not the government work. About half of that is government. The other half is the private sector following our legislation that requires whoever is investing, be it an agricultural project or a forestry project, whatever it is, it needs to preserve a certain amount of the native vegetation. And the data in Brazil is that the average agricultural rural property in Brazil preserves about 50%, about half of the property is preserved. So that complements, the protected public areas, and you have this tremendous amount, this tremendous result in terms of preserving vegetation, having the big carbon sequestration that takes place in the Amazon and other places in Brazil, including by agriculture, by sustainable agriculture.
Well, thank you. And please do count on us. The private sector is actually eager to be part of this discussion and part of the solutions, as it will take all of us together, right? I'm going to pivot now to some other questions here on the chat. I want to go back to the collaboration, current and future government-to-government collaboration on rebuilding and addressing the pandemic and health and rebuilding post-pandemic. If you can please elaborate more how that collaboration is happening. And I would add to this, how can we, the private sector, continue to support addressing the pandemic?
Can I start? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Please.
Yeah. No, I just want to highlight, we've been working together since the get-go of the pandemic at different levels. There's been an effort led by the White House that gathers people from about 15 countries discussing, the scientific aspects of the effort to fight the pandemic, the vaccines, treatment, medication, the logistics of all the effort, etc. And Brazil has been a part of that. We really appreciate. That's one level. The private sector, we have I think the great news is that the investment announced by Pfizer and the joint venture with the Brazilian company Europharma to produce vaccines in Brazil beginning next year. We have a great role played by our foundations, Fiocruz, the federal one, and the Butantan Institute in the state of São Paulo. And there's so much going on in terms of partnerships. The private sector has been doing great things in terms of equipments that are necessary, medications, components of the vaccine effort, and so on. And I don't think we could have achieved the tremendous result we achieved without this level of cooperation coming from the government and the private sector. looking ahead, we need to be better prepared when this strikes again. And one way to do this is, of course, having the capacity in Brazil to manufacture the vaccines, our own vaccines. And Brazil has perhaps, the capacity with the institutions I just mentioned, that's very unique. At the same time, since we're talking about the pandemic, Brazil has a very unique vaccine culture. We're very much pro-vaccine, and then we have these numbers: 95% with one shot, 70% with both, and 38,000 postal vaccination around the country. It's really amazing. But in a broader picture, Accession, I think what we should do is see how we can improve the climate for investment in Brazil, advance economic reforms, and try to do more in trade and investment in the supply chains. All that leads together to an improvement in the overall picture that will impact our population, the most vulnerable, those most affected by the pandemic.
I agree with everything that Nestor said. I would add some additional things as well, things that we're doing. We talked about OECD. I want to talk about 5G and Open RAN. I mean, it's really important to any country and to the people of those countries to ensure that their communication and their information is going to be secure. And so we're working very closely with the Ministry of Communications, with Anatel and others to promote the promise of Open RAN, which is a software-based architecture under 5G, used under 4G as well. It's flexible, it's cost-effective, but above all, it's secure. It doesn't rely on single vendors. And so this is one area that we think will improve the climate for trade and investment. Another is cybersecurity. We know that countries around the world are subject to cyber attacks all the time, with tremendous impacts on the economy. And Brazil is no stranger to that either. And so we're working together in that area. In terms of Build Back Better World, these are discussions that we're having now. We're looking for ways to work together more on infrastructure. We've got two infrastructure dedicated specialists who work with ministries here in Brazil. As I mentioned, we're also looking at bringing in the DFC to establish permanent positions in Brazil to help foster investment. We talked about the investment incentive agreement, which is something that we would like to accomplish in the near term. We're looking at a high-level dialogue to occur in the next couple of months that has an economic pillar, a democracy pillar, and a security pillar. And this would certainly be a principal part of the economic pillar. Investment screening is big. We've talked about that before. That's another area that we're working together with Brazil on to strengthen investment screening. And so there's so many ways that we're working together. We've got Carlos on the line who can speak better than anyone else about vaccine production and supply chains and the need to have dependable production. And Brazil has so much potential to offer so much to the world in terms of COVID-19 vaccine production. So there's just so many ways. We've talked about critical supply chains, talked about the U.S. BEF. So I'm just amazed every week that we talk together with our country team here to hear what's going on across this huge mission as both countries work together.
We couldn't agree more as a private sector on all of these priorities that both of you mentioned. And there's so many questions coming in now, and I know we're running out of time. Can we expect, very quickly going over some of these questions, can we expect the digital trade negotiations that was left at the table last year, can we expect that to move forward? And there's a question here related to cybersecurity. How can the private sector support those efforts?
So very fast, digital trade. Brazil is ready to do it. It takes two to tango. And we're ready to do more beyond digital trade. So that was a short answer, but full of meaning. The second part, the cybersecurity. I mean, American companies are most welcome to help us in that effort. It's a joint effort. There's a great cooperation, government to government in this area, and we are working in finding ways to deepen it. Let me just add one thing about the OECD that was mentioned. I didn't mention, but that was mentioned in the opening, the keynote address by President Bolsonaro. We've been knocking at this door since 2017. Life is made of window of opportunities, etc. It's about time that we, begin in earnest the negotiations. And we greatly appreciate the support that was conveyed by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in his visit to Brazil. He recently reiterated it in a meeting we had recently here in Washington. But we need more than, vocal support. We need to make it happen. We need concrete results. The sooner we start these negotiations, the sooner we're going to finish them. They're going to take a couple of years. So I wouldn't waste too much time on that.
I don't have anything more to add on digital trade. I'll refer you to my colleague Daniel Watson. And on cybersecurity, we're always looking to work with the private sector on best practices. We have great relationships down in Sao Paulo with private sector, and that's just something we'll continue to be working on.
Yes, and do count on the U.S. Chamber and our companies, because that is an area that we're also doing a lot of work on and defining principles and best practices. Unfortunately, we have really come to an end. I could keep this going, but we have a full program. I couldn't conclude, thinking about the conclusion here, two words come to mind: optimism and constructive conversation and engagement. And do count on us in executing these next steps. Us private sector, we're all about, let's do it, let's make it happen, and let's reap the great benefits for both our nations, especially now that we need to create jobs, we need prosperity here and in Brazil. So please count on us for all of these initiatives and actions that you both have laid out. We are your partner in making it happen. With that, thank you so much, Ambassador Nestor. Thank you, Charge Doug. I know you have both very busy schedules, but again, much appreciated. And thank you, Carlos, for joining us as well.
Pleasure.
With that,
thank you very much for inviting me here today.
Thank you.
Thank you all. With that, I'll turn it over to the next panel. Bye-bye. We have now come to a special moment of our Connect Summit. It's really an honor to welcome and introduce our next speaker, Joberto Azevedo, whose name and lifelong accomplishments are known globally. Joberto Azevedo is currently Executive Vice President, Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Pepsi, and Chairman of the PepsiCo Foundation. Previously, Joberto was a career diplomat for the Brazilian government and served as Director General of the World Trade Organization for many years. We're delighted to announce that Joberto has kindly accepted the U.S. Chamber's invitation to serve as the Brazil Council's next chair, beginning in January 2022. Joberto, with your lifelong experience in navigating complex political and regulatory environments, we are confident that under your leadership, you will provide valuable guidance in strengthening the economic partnership of our nations on behalf of the American and Brazilian business communities. On behalf of the U.S. Chamber, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Cassia, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for hosting this conference today. And I look forward to in-person gatherings in the near future when it's safe to travel again. I am truly honored by the invitation of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to serve as chair of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council. And I have to say that I'm really excited to take on the role in 2022. As a Brazilian, I see this opportunity as a unique chance to contribute to the economic and social development of my country. There's a lot to do. It's an important moment in the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Brazil. In fact, given the potentialities always present in the relationship between Brazil and the U.S., one could almost say that every moment is an important moment. But what really places us in a different situation today is that the amount of unrealized opportunities is quite consequential. There is real potential to deepen economic cooperation and promote shared prosperity for the two countries. The Council can help us get there by advocating on our collective behalf for a deeper economic partnership and integration. It can offer an ambitious and strategic vision of the way forward. It can help pave an objective and viable path marked with attainable milestones that help expand the relationship and deliver concrete outcomes in the near future. There are numerous prospects and areas where the two countries can increase collaboration, including by advancing innovation, competitiveness, and productivity, promoting a more successful positioning of the two economies in global markets. At PepsiCo, we have an important business in Brazil where we act as a local company. We try to trigger social and economic growth throughout our supply chain and bring prosperity to the communities in which we operate. This is in full alignment with the Council's agenda, and I believe there are significant opportunities for us jointly to collaborate even more at a bilateral level and on the global stage. And I look forward to working with all of the U.S. companies investing in Brazil, as well as the two governments, to build lasting relationships and share prosperity for both countries. Looking forward to seeing you all soon. Until then, thanks again.
The U.S. Chamber and the National Confederation of Industry, CNI, have a long-standing partnership that established the Brazil-U.S. Business Council 45 years ago. Since then, we have worked closely together with Brazil's private sector to develop a common understanding and a shared vision for this relationship. It is now my pleasure to welcome and introduce the chair of the Brazil section, commonly known as CBIL. José Serrador is Vice President of Institutional Relations of Embraer and has recently assumed the leadership role on the Brazil side. Serrador, thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you very much, Cássia. I would like to thank you, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for the invitation to participate in the 2021 U.S. Brazil Connect Summit. I'd like to especially greet the new chairman of the U.S. section of CBIL, my good friend Joberto Azevedo. His leadership will certainly strengthen the role of the Council. Welcome to CBIL, Roberto. Last June, I had the honor and privilege to be appointed the president of Brazil section of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council. Since then, we have updated our priorities, met with governmental representatives from both countries and other relevant stakeholders for the bilateral relations. The importance of the United States for Brazil is unquestionable. The country is Brazil's second largest trading partner, accounting for 12.4% of total imports and exports in 2020. The United States is also the second largest market for Brazil's total exports and the principal market for manufactured goods and services. We face a new momentum in which dialogue and collaborations are required to achieve mutual benefits for the private sectors from Brazil and from the US. Climate change and sustainability now have a main role in commercial negotiations, requiring transparent communications about which actions are being taken, not only by the federal government, but also by Brazilian states and municipalities. The Brazilian companies represented at the Brazil-US Business Council also have a great contribution showcasing their ESG commitments, which are very ambitious, not only on sustainability. I would like to emphasize 5 priorities to improve the business environment in the perspective of the Brazilian section of the Brazil-US Business Council. The first is the internalization of the Protocol on Trade and Transparency Rules signed in 2020. The protocol can increase the flow of goods and capital between the 2 countries, and it will support future negotiations for a broader trade agreement. While in the United States, the agreement depends exclusively on the executive branch to come into force, in Brazil, the approval of the Congress is required before the enactment by the President. 2, support for Brazil's accession to the OECD. Brazil has already incorporated 99 of the 245 binding OECD instruments, such as agreements, arrangements, recommendations, declarations, or decisions. This represents 40% of the instruments adopted, more than the other 5 competitors for accession into the organization. Besides negotiating the adhesion of the codes of liberalization of capital movements and current invisible operations, Brazil is engaged in promoting reforms in critical areas for the industry, such as taxation and intellectual property rights. 3, ratification of the Mutual Recognition Agreement, MRA, between the Authorized Economic Operators programs. The MRA allows the procedures adopted in Brazil to be recognized by the US and vice versa. The Brazilian AEO model achieved a reduction of over 70% in time for customs inspections. In exports, the average time for cargo clearing fell from 3.5 hours to less than 1 hour, and in the imports from more than 23 hours to 4 hours. Although both governments have given high-level instructions to continue negotiations in 2020, the steps of validation and identification of benefits, prerequisites, and information sharing and formalization of the MRA are still pending. Renewal of the US Generalized System of Preferences. The GSP is strategic for Brazilian exports as it guarantees equal competition with large economies, especially those with which the United States has trade agreements, such as Canada, Japan, and South Korea. Today, tariff exemption is granted on more than 3,000 Brazilian products. In 2019, 7% of Brazilian imports were made by GSP, which represents more than $2 billion. The GSP is also important for American importers who saved more than $80 million in purchases from Brazil. And last, 5, start the negotiations for a bilateral tax treaty. The United States is the largest foreign investor in Brazil and the country's largest single partner in the royalty trade between parent and subsidiary companies. On the other hand, the US market is the main destination for the overseas operations of Brazilian transnational corporations. Therefore, a BTT will have positive impacts on the operation of Brazilian companies that involve payments for services and royalties, which are fundamental for adding value to manufactured goods. The Brazilian and the US BTT models converge on several points. However, there are 3 points that may require broader negotiations: the provision for services taxation, transfer prices, and dispute settlement. To conclude, I would like to invite you all to join us in the next Brazil-US Business Council plenary session that will be held on November 17th. The meeting will focus on bilateral trade and sustainability that undoubtedly will be the center of bilateral government agenda for the upcoming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serrador, for sharing the priorities and the perspective of the Brazilian private sector. We look forward to collaborating, continue our partnership with you, and wish you great success in this role. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't think we can have a U.S. Brazil Connect Summit without connecting with the private sector, right? So this panel here today with us will bring us the perspective of the private sector on the state of the U.S. Brazil bilateral relationship. I have the pleasure of sharing this panel with three outstanding speakers. They are experienced executives in the US and Brazil and have a lot to say about the bilateral relationship. So let me start with introducing briefly my three guests today. Lisa, a colleague, she is the Global Director of Trade and Investment Policy for Dow. She's well known in the DC circles for her work and engagement in several organizations. I don't know how she does it. She's the chair of the Women in International Trade. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a board member of WITA. I don't know how she does it. She graduated from George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. Lisa, welcome. My second guest is a champion of the U.S.-Brazil relationship. Landon Loomis is Boeing's Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean and Boeing's Global Policy Director. Has extensive experience with the U.S. government. He has served at the White House, USTR, at U.S. embassies in Beijing and Brasilia. He has a master's degree in international economics and is fluent in 4 languages, including Portuguese. Also with us today is Daniel Bustos. He is the Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer for Accelerate Energy, responsible for the commercial development of the LNG importation projects. Daniel earned a nuclear engineering degree from Instituto Balseiro in Argentina. He holds both a nuclear engineering master's degree and an MBA in corporate finance. Thanks to all of you for being here today. No bilateral relationship, it survives and is strong without an engaging private sector. So here they are today. I'm going to start this session with a provocation. Despite all the difficulties we had last year, we also had a very vibrant bilateral relationship. The two countries were able to sign a trade protocol in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. That was a great feat. We also know that US and Brazil have very different election cycles. So that sometimes makes things a little challenging. So in the US, we have a new government in 2021. In Brazil, we have general elections in 2022. So my first question to all three speakers today, despite this lack of election sync, let's say that, these two governments have shown that they can work under adverse conditions. How do you see the US-Brazil relationship today? How can we use this time to really achieve progress in the bilateral relationship? I will turn first to Landon and then Lisa and Daniel. Landon, the mic is yours, please.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Renata. Great to be with everybody and to be talking about, the really important bilateral relationship between the United States and Brazil. I'm speaking, from kind of from the outside looking in as we think about the political aspects of the bilateral relationship. But I would observe, kind of along the lines that you did, Renata, that there's, if you take kind of look over the last 18 months, which intentionally kind of, as you were kind of laying out the election cycles, it intentionally starts in the last administration, the last U.S. administration. Just think about what's been done. A deepened defense relationship and strategic kind of cooperation, building on work that had been done, signing the GSOMIA, the DCA, the technology safeguard agreements, conferring on Brazil major non-NATO ally status. And we see that as those relationships have been forged, U.S. companies have been able to now take advantage of space cooperation. And we've seen a renewed engagement and kind of participation by U.S. space companies in the Brazil market. This administration removed travel barriers for Brazil and other countries, which is going to allow the very natural demand that exists for our two countries at the person-to-person level, at the student level, tourism and business travel to commence after being suspended for the pandemic. We see Bolsonaro in preparation for attending the Biden convened climate summit in April, accelerating Brazil's national commitment to reach carbon net zero from 2060 to 2050, making a conscious commitment to respond to a clear demand signal that was coming, globally for Brazil to be a leader in this space. We've had high-level visits. Nick Burns and Jake Sullivan and others have engaged their interlocutors and met with Bolsonaro and explained U.S. policy. And on issues that matter to the U.S., like Venezuela, Brazil defines itself by engaging very constructively, both on kind of the democratic agenda inside, the dictatorship of Venezuela, but also in receiving and kind of welcoming 500,000 Venezuelan migrants, right? So across multiple areas of mutual interest, there's a lot going on. And I think to me, what's important, and I think you're right, Renata, to point out that these elections occur, but what I see is this general trend of, it's not about the presidents in charge in either place, it's the two countries that exist underneath those governments that are partners. And we tire of describing the potential invested there, but if you think about going from Obama to Trump to Biden in the U.S., and then Rousseff, Temer, Bolsonaro in Brazil, the trajectory of the items we just laid out exists despite the changes that have taken place in both countries. Very distinct and different leaders coming on both sides, and despite those differences, this common agenda exists. And the thing that I would just observe with that background is, no one is trying to blow that up. Everyone sees that it's in our interest to work together. We can operate out of enlightened self-interest and get a lot done. Brazil is just the essential economy in South America. It's bigger than all 12 of its neighbors combined. So there's a lot for us to gain by continuing that productive track record that we've built over multiple administrations in both countries.
Thank you, Landon. I like your positive angle and also a great summary of what has happened the past 2 years, more than 2 years. A lot happened in the defense sector, and we are encouraged by that. Let me ask Lisa to say a few words about the bilateral relationship. Lisa, go ahead.
Absolutely, Renata, and thank you. Thanks for being part of this, because I think the reason that you have a private sector panel for the Connect Summit is it's kind of the answer to your question as well. And I'll build on Landon's positive assessment. I think one of the other great things that underpins a lot of that political activity and the progress we've made over the last couple of years is the private sector. The fact is, many of our companies represent long-standing partners, operations for decades in each other's territories. And the fact is, we have a very common set of interests. So many of the achievements that have been made to date, focusing on things like customs simplification or regulatory cooperation, they speak to our common interest about creating that kind of enabling environment where we can all be really successful on a commercial and economic level in each other's territories. It's all about streamlining and further facilitating the partnerships that we've been evolving as companies over decades, if not longer. And I think it demonstrates a lot of the continued push from the private sector is to keep that progress going, where we can focus on a lot of common areas of interest like sustainability and circular economy. We're all looking at our communities and wanting to do better. How can we share the kind of technologies and process innovations that allow us to be part of creating a better, not only kind of manufacturing work stream, but delivering better products for consumers in both of our territories. I think when you look at a lot of those interests, it's really the private sector bringing the ideas to the government that can help enable and demonstrate why so many of these policy activities are really important. And I think the one area that I've seen a tremendous amount of common attention to is focusing on our workforce and improving and growing our operations. The involvement in our communities, so that we're not only looking at just commercial operations, but ones that are really demonstrating, whether it's environmental, economic, or social, real progress for our workers, the communities that we're operating in, and the broader economies writ large. That's an incredible dynamic to tap into, and it's a really critical element of the U.S. Brazil relationship. I think it's why we've made so much progress to date, especially with willing government leaders. And it's why we have a lot of opportunities going forward, independent of the election cycles we all struggle through. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. You were totally right. Yes, we've made a lot of progress. Customs automation, trade facilitation, and workforce, very important pieces of this puzzle. So thank you for your insights. I will turn now to Daniel. Daniel, take it away.
Oh, Renata, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. And oh my God, it's an honor to be with Lisa, with Landon. They bring their massive experience. And I think they both brought very interesting angles. I think the geopolitics of the relationship, the fact, as Lisa said, private companies have been working from the two sides, making substantial investments on the two markets. Nothing of that will change. I do not believe that the election cycles will change that. We're going to manage that. I would like to bring attention to one aspect that is very important, and we're seeing it these days, and particularly Accelerate Energy is an international energy company, is the enormous opportunity of the impact the commodities markets, and Brazil is the perfect example of that, both energy and food commodities, the disruptions that these commodities are bringing to the world are putting in high relief the value of cooperation and trust between large partners. For the US to have a stable, predictable Brazil, a country that is being for now several years on a road of opening their market, of making the energy markets and the commodity markets in general more efficient, is priceless. And for Brazil, of course, to have the support of the US in times where we more than ever realize how important the hidden part of the economy, let me call it in a certain way, the boring part of the economy, of connecting markets, of having the right trade regulations, of having common language when talking about customs, of simplifying logistics. That part that is unseen by the common user, it is shown now in very high relief how critical it is. That collaboration can only happen when you see governments like the US and Brazilian government constantly achieving step by step positive growth on the relationships, regardless who's sitting on the main seat. And then the large communities of investors, companies like Dow and Boeing, of course, but Petrobras, private companies in Brazil investing in the US, companies like Accelerate taking critical roles on supplementing renewables in Brazil, as we're doing now. We're taking a major position on securing energy for Brazil. That part of the economy, the logistics, the optimization, has been left aside, not because professionals weren't working on it, they have been working, but because it works so well that people minimize the risk. I want to take this opportunity, and I think all of us on this panel have been seeing the impact. It is an enormous opportunity for the world economy to better understand these impacts. For Brazil and the US, is a prime example of areas where we're going to see eye to eye for years to come. And yes, I'm extremely optimistic about this relationship, without a doubt.
Thank you, Daniel. I think part of what you said has to do with supply chain resilience and regional integration, something that we certainly think the US and Brazil should be working on. Very important. I'm going to turn now to the second round of questions. And the first one is for my friend Lisa. Lisa reached out to us about 3 months ago, I think, to give us the good news that Dow is now the chair company of the U.S. Brazil CO Forum, the U.S. section of the forum. The council, the Brazil Council, has always worked collaboratively with the forum. We know we're going to continue to do that, especially now with Lisa at the helm of the forum. Please, Lisa, give us an update on the CEO Forum. What are the plans for the future? How can we collaborate? Take it away.
Thank you so much, Renata. And we are thrilled. We are absolutely honored as DAO to be the U.S. chair of the U.S. Brazil CEO Forum, working in close partnership with Stefanini, who is the Brazil chair. And that partnership is really, that's an inherent dynamic we want to continue with the CEO Forum, working in close partnership with the council and, quite frankly, all of industry. We've got 24 fantastic companies appointed to the CEO Forum. And that is a great venue and umbrella to bring all of us together, because it's exactly as Daniel was saying too, when we think about a lot of these issues, it doesn't matter if you're a Brazilian company or a US company, Americans in Brazil or Brazilians operating here, we have a lot of common challenges. And that's exactly what we want to get into and address as the CEO Forum, building on, as Landon was describing, some of the great political successes to date, including the APEC trade deal. Now it's about how we seek the opportunity to sit down with government and really translate these commitments into actionable agendas, how we can demonstrate the impact of something like trade facilitation, which sounds terribly technical and wonky, but if you're in the supply chain of any large organization, it makes a difference. If you're a small company now looking to break into the Brazilian market, customs efficiencies can make or break that opportunity. We see the same in areas like regulatory cooperation. Chemical management law might not be the first thing most people think of when they're looking to break into a market, but it can make the difference of whether or not your product can be approved, whether you can actually get into a sales position. And these things are really critical. And that's why, with the expertise that we can offer as industry, that's one of the things that we're looking to do now over the next couple of months. So we most recently had in the CEO Forum what we call as the joint prep meeting. And that was a fantastic opportunity to both hear from government in terms of the agenda US and Brazilian governments are both working on, a lot of reform initiatives, which not surprisingly line up really well with the kind of initiatives industry is looking at. As Daniel said, supply chain resiliency. But we need to dial deeper down into what does that really mean? What are the actual barriers and what are the opportunities that we're trying to capture? The more we can translate that into real numbers, real impact, investment, and workforce creation, that's how we can really drive the political will to make things happen. So what we are working on now are workshops, engagements with the Brazilian government, which we will definitely be Brazilian and US, I should say, which we are definitely bringing our partners into so that we as industry can sit down and really help unpack what these issues mean in a way that demonstrates real areas of opportunity, especially as countries struggle with everything we've gone through in the last 18 months. We need to look ahead to how recovery can really be not only enabled, but expedited. So we're looking at areas like infrastructure, especially sustainable infrastructure, cybersecurity, where we have very common interests, not only in the infrastructure, but in the resiliency of the system and the opportunity to share information on threat assessments. Regulatory cooperation with the commitments in APEC on good regulatory practices, we can now potentially pilot real specifics on that for certain sectors, chemicals, medical devices, etc. So we're really looking to translate common interest into areas of opportunity and real actionable agenda items that'll all feed into what I know, touch wood, will be a very successful US Brazil CEO Forum scheduled to be held in February of next year. I hope that helped, Renata.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm glad to hear you're already doing a lot of prep work, and please, we are at your disposal to help with the workshops, the engagement, and the actual meeting next February. Thank you, Lisa, for the update. I will turn to Landon now. I consider Landon an expert in US-Brazil relations. You know, he worked for the US government for a long time. He lived in Brasilia. He's now in São Paulo, based in São Paulo. He knows the language, the Portuguese language. Please give us some guidance. Let's zoom in a little bit on areas that you think both governments should focus on now.
Okay. I just want to, as Lisa was talking, I thought also, really the role of the CEO dialogue and of the Brazil-U.S. Business Council is essential right now, because we have to speak very clearly about what the opportunities are that we're talking about. Because if we don't clearly articulate that and state that and insert that into the discussion, then we're going to have other voices that are, in my view, paying less close attention to Brazil, but have very strong opinions. They'll take up the airtime. So I think for those of us who do spend a lot of time looking closely at the relationship, who do see the benefits, it's really time for us to be clear about what we're talking about, what we see forward, because that message will sell itself once we articulate it clearly. And so that's kind of what you've asked me to talk about. I think, I completely agree with Lisa. And in fact, Danielle, for that matter, I'm a big fan of boring. I love boring. I love technical and wonky. That's where the substance is. So I fully endorse those, all the approaches you've mentioned along those lines. I would mention three things that I think we can do and need to do more closely. One, we have to build a positive economic agenda. We have to state clearly what we're going after. And the components of that, Lisa went over many of them. So the regulatory agenda is important, not just because in each individual industry, the companies who exist in that sector will benefit from, a more streamlined and a more efficient, less costly experience. It will also create a mechanism for the U.S. and Brazil to express their shared values in open markets through the regulatory system itself. So there's a way for broader, for that engagement to have a broader impact at a strategic level. I think the trade agreement, and Lisa mentioned the ATEC process, and it resulted in a mini trade deal of sorts. There were other components that nearly were completed and then were left undone. In the digital space, we're just, everyone is trying to figure out, how do we deal with digital issues? Well, we have a digital agreement half written. So let's prioritize the work that's done and prioritize completing it. So I think that incremental steps, building on the work that's been done, would be another productive use of time. I think also on the positive economic agenda front, you've got a broad commitment that the United States and Brazil share to market economic practices related to subsidies and intellectual property and things of that nature. We are two large economies. If we can start to formalize our shared values in those disciplines, it will have a big impact on major industries where, distorting subsidies are problematic. And I think that Brazil and the United States probably agree on most of those issues as we look at, where the rest of the world is on some of the same questions. We could work together. So just clearly articulating a positive economic agenda and using the size of our economies and the influence we have overseas to jointly kind of advocate for that would be good. The other one I want to mention is on the environment. I know that the environment is often a defensive area where things get complicated quickly, but I see an opportunity for Brazil to lead, and I'll speak specifically about the Boeing perspective, because we are, I'm here in Colombia right now talking about how we decarbonize aviation in the face of a commitment from the industry to reach net zero by 2050. And the way that Boeing was going to take many different approaches, but probably the most impactful of them will be the use of sustainable aviation fuels. The production of those fuels, so they save 80% of the carbon footprint of a flight. So that's the upside. The problem is we need 10,000 times more fuel than we have today. So we have to solve for scale. Brazil is perfectly positioned to help increase the scale production of sustainable aviation fuels. So it's about finding those opportunities where their expertise in aviation, agriculture, and energy perfectly combine to address a global problem. There are opportunities for Brazil to step into the environmental discussion in a very decisive, productive, positive way, and lead. And so I'd love it for that to be in my sector. I'm sure there are other opportunities as well. And the last thing I'll mention quickly is just on the defense side. There's a series of military exercises, the largest ever held in Louisiana earlier this year. There are new exercises happening together later this year, underpinned by the agreements we talked about. I think that the defense and strategic cooperation, which probably embraces the space sector as well, is just, we see eye to eye on these issues, and the closer we stay in that sector, I think the better for everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Len. That was great. Actually, I agree with all of your points on defense. We are very supportive of the RDT&E agreement that is pending approval in the Brazilian government. Speaking in the Brazilian Congress, speaking of that, also you mentioned the trade protocol. A lot of work was put into concluding that agreement. We really need to see that agreement approved by the Brazilian Congress too. And there is also that fourth chapter that is half done that we should continue to pursue, which is the digital trade chapter. So a lot to be done. Thank you for your guidance. I'm going to turn now to Daniel. And I actually, looking back, I think that there are a lot of positive news to talk about on defense, on trade, on the new U.S. Brazil CEO Forum. But let's zoom in on the energy industry. I think it's the role of the private sector not just to criticize, but also to offer solutions and to talk about the good positive developments in Brazil too. There's a lot of good work being done in Brazil. My question to you is about a specific structural reform in the energy sector in Brazil and your company recent experience on that.
Thank you, Renata. The Brazilian government embarked in a deregulation and liberalization of the energy market over 10 years ago. We have seen, of course, a more significant progress, I would say, on the last 4 or 5 years, but that would be a disservice to the previous administrations that actually started pushing a very, very critical task, as is to give Petrobras the chance to be a competitive company at the same time that Petrobras removes part of their weight from the market, allowing private companies taking more diverse, more important roles. I think it has been a success story. At the same time, it does show not the weakness of the Brazilian system, but the weakness that we see around the world. There are 2 points that, as accelerate, we tend to focus, particularly because we tend to go to the developing world to try to solve problems. We tend to say there are wealthy people problems and there are poor people problems related to energy. They're both very important. As accelerate, we choose to deal with poorer people problems. And energy poverty is an endemic problem that has to be addressed. In the case of Brazil, energy poverty is not only a source of economic stagnation, it's one of the largest sources of CO2 emissions due to burning wood, for example, for cooking and for energy in large sectors of the Brazilian economy. And we do believe that the action that the Brazilian government has enacted through the years of giving space to private companies to enter into the space is definitely the right step. You do not solve the enormous problems on energy access, energy poverty in Brazil through a single government-sponsored company. It just doesn't work. So in that sense, I think it's a great success. We are already seeing companies taking roles, innovating on how to bring energy closer to the people. The other problem that we're seeing is market stability. And market instability, when you have a country the size of Brazil, I love that phrase, Brazil serves the world breakfast. That is a very positive thing. It's a great role for Brazil, but it shows how intertwined these markets are. Just to give you an example, of course, these days, natural gas prices are making the headlines like never before. Brazil is one of the largest new buyers of LNG this year. China, for example, is actually buying less LNG these days due to the price. Brazil cannot afford due to the historical drought that they're facing. That is an energy problem, but it's not only an energy problem. Lisa knows this very well. The fertilizers industry is suffering enormously. And in Brazil, you have farmers that are not able to afford fertilizers to start the harvest in a season that finally shows promise to to give the farmers a little bit of breathing space after years of drought, that problem is going to impact on 2022, is going to probably impact on 2023. So when the Brazilian government moves towards liberalization, it's not only helping the energy markets, it's not only helping a gas bill, a power bill, it's helping keeping stable one of the world's largest food producers. And that is part of energy transition too. That is part of the environmental agenda. There are few places in the world where energy and farming are so intertwined as in Brazil. And we see the role of companies like Accelerate stepping into the role of providing new access to energy, of making sure that private companies start learning how to access energy, not through Petrobras, but through different private companies, and making sure that the new cycles that are going to come are going to be less impactful for the economy, making sure that when these kind of cycles that tend to be seen a little bit in advance are predicted, private companies can invest into minimizing those impacts. It is a very important role. As Accelerate, we have experienced firsthand what it means to have the collaboration of the Minister of Energy, the Agencia Nacional de Petróleo, CADE, into implementing a project in record time, as we're doing to bring the Bahia terminal into service. But the challenges are going to keep growing. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the reason we're here. That's the reason why Lisa and Landon are here. We're here because it's challenging, but it's valuable. The energy agenda is going to keep progressing. And the US company has the right companies. The US companies have been doing business in Brazil for decades. That will not change. I love seeing more companies the size of Nature of Accelerate entering and succeeding in the Brazilian market. And I hope that we're going to open the way for some of those.
Thank you, Daniel. Very interesting insights on energy poverty, farming and energy intertwine, and the powerhouse that Brazil is in that industry. I think you're right that we can't give credit only to this administration for the openness of the market. This has been going on for 10 years. We now see, a couple months ago, the enactment of the new gas law, but that is something that it took a long time to actually happen. So credit to the Brazilian government for persevering, and the challenge continues. You're right. I am going now to just wrapping up and asking you to say a final words about the relationship and the role of the private sector. I think we talked a lot about that already. So if you have any final words that you can share with us, please do so. Lisa?
Absolutely, Renata. As you know me very well, in typical fashion, it's a call to action. This is an area you've heard from all of us. There's a lot of common interests in engagement here, whether it's ensuring we've got energy policy that's not only supporting the energy industry, but advancing downstream manufacturing, or working through many of these technical trade issues. It's in all of our interests to see a better enabling environment, stronger economic ties between these two great economies. So encourage you to get involved. We appreciate the partnership with the Council, and know that we'll look forward to using all of these channels, the Council, the CEO Forum, and our own interactions to really advance this common agenda. Obrigado.
Thank you, Lisa. Landon, final words.
Yep. Great, thanks. I just, again, I think of that perspective that this relationship has traversed a lot of different political leadership. And I think it's incumbent on us to define the economic and business interests that we have looking forward, the way that we can, contribute to growing prosperity, economic growth in both countries, identify inefficiencies, eliminate them, identify commonalities, and accentuate them and kind of lean into them. There's, we've talked about a bunch of examples. I hope and encourage that our government partners will help lead that charge, but I think it's upon us to really define that agenda and advocate for it. So I appreciate the opportunity to have that discussion today. Thanks, Renata.
Thank you for being here. Daniel, final words.
Thank you, Renata. I only see opportunities. Every obstacle, every issue to increase trade, to bring investments has an opportunity behind. It has unlocked value. I'm incredibly optimistic, but as Landon and Lisa said, the call to action, this is not just saying things, it's keep finding the next obstacle, the next thing, and just dealing with it, just remove it. Every single step, no matter how small, is a positive step if what you're doing is making the life a little bit easier for the next company that is going to do business. These two economies can only grow together, but as Landon and Lisa said, there's a lot of boring work, which I love too, that companies have to do. Is a call for action that I enormously endorse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, we love boring work. They're essential. I want to thank you all. You know, there cannot be a Brazil Connect Summit without connecting with the private sector, as I said in the beginning. So thank you for your time. This is a wrap. We hope to see you again on the 3rd edition next year. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks so much for having us. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Waiting for the go ahead from the Brazil Council. Hi, great. I'm Gabrielle Treyvat. I'm Managing Director for Brazil and the Southern Cone at McClarty Associates, and it is my distinct pleasure to be moderating and hosting this panel today with two very, very distinguished former U.S. ambassadors to Brazil, Ambassador Mike McKinley and Ambassador Rynick. You know, our panel is about 30 minutes, a little less, and it would, you know, probably take me about 30 minutes just to introduce our two guests. So I'll abbreviate in the interest of time and launch right into our questions. First, I'll start with Ambassador Rynick, who is currently Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs at the Royal Caribbean Group, where she oversees global communications and government relations. The ambassador has enjoyed a very distinguished career in the public and private sector, including most recently, where many of us have had a chance to work with her as President of America for Boeing. And prior to that, with PepsiCo and Kraft, Ambassador Rynick was a career officer, have served across Latin America, including, of course, many of us first had the pleasure to meet her as ambassador to Brazil in 2002, 2004, but also as ambassador to Venezuela, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic. And we also have Ambassador Mike McKinley with us, who was a senior counselor at the Coleman Group, who also has a very long and decorated career in the Foreign Service. He most recently served as senior ambassador to the Secretary of State, and previously as our country's ambassador to Peru, Colombia, Afghanistan, and of course, Brazil from 2017 to 2018. Ambassador McKinley has significant experience managing global issues from peace negotiations to including FTAs, and we're super delighted that he is here as well with us today to lend us some insights and expertise. So I will begin, I think, with an opening question for both of you. You know, we've heard a lot about sort of, you know, the opportunities for business and sort of the environment. If I can speak a little bit more about political slant here.
Sorry, Gabrielle, your sound is going in and out. I don't know if Donna's having the same issue.
Same issue. Okay, let's try this. How is that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Hiccups with audio. So my first question, which I'll pose to the both of you, although maybe we can start with Ambassador McKinley. Observers of the U.S. and Brazil have often remarked how similar the two countries are. We're both large, diverse democracies, stretching across wide geographic areas that are all quite distinctive culturally and politically. And the current political environment in Brazil, with a year to go until the presidential election, I think is quite akin as well to the U.S. experience leading up to our own presidential in 2020, where we saw political polarization fueled by social media and, of course, the urgent need to address the COVID-19 economic recovery. My question is, can you offer, your perspectives as seasoned observers and watchers of Brazil, having served, in various capacities with the country? What are your thoughts on this moment that Brazil is experiencing right now, and the outlook as well for investment and what is business climate?
So, Ambassador Rynick, do you want to go first, or?
I think she called on you. Go ahead,
Oh,
Ambassador
sorry.
McKinley, aka Mike.
Hey, Donna. We'll drop the titles. That's good. And I don't think we can sugarcoat the political moment. It's a difficult moment in Brazil. It's a difficult moment in bilateral relations, but I would like to suggest a context. If you take a look at developments across the region, if you take a look at developments across the globe, in Europe, in different parts of Asia, many of the phenomena or controversies we're seeing at the moment are present in other political cultures. And the question really becomes the strength of institutions and their ability to respond to the moment. Many of the headlines that we see in the United States lag somewhat behind developments in Brazil. So if we were stuck in a moment of time, say 2 months ago, we would be looking at a pandemic that was a pandemic response that was struggling to introduce a vaccine program. We would look at a commitment to COP26, the upcoming environmental summit in Glasgow, where there was no clear definition of a Brazilian position. And we might even be questioning the state of dialogue between the United States and Brazil. Fast forward to where we are now, and we're looking at a situation where approximately close to 70% of the Brazilian adult population has received a first vaccine. We're approaching 40% on a second vaccine. We're looking at commitments which were made just in the last few days by the Vice President, by the Minister of Environment on accelerating Brazil's commitments to meet net zero reductions by 2050, to accelerate meeting the target set only in September at the UN of ending illegal deforestation, moving that date up by 2 or 3 years. In other words, a shifting panorama on how the government is responding. And in terms of the United States, there have been the letters from the U.S. Senate, from the U.S. House of Representatives. There have also been the visits of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, by the head of the CIA, William Burns. We saw Minister Geddes meet with Treasury Secretary Yellen in October, and there have been a host of contacts at different levels with Secretary Kerry's team on environmental questions. So my point on the political environment is it's complex, it's challenging. We should not ignore what is happening in Brazil, the questions that are being raised on a number of fronts, but we should also look at the elements which suggest continuity. On the economic front, the fact of the matter is, if we took projections from the IMF World Bank in January, February, Brazil was going to be growing at 3.5%, 3.7%. We're looking at a growth rate of 5.2% for the year now, just a few months later. We're looking at a very successful program in cushioning the impact of the pandemic, economic impact of the pandemic on less well-off Brazilians with the U.S Brazil program, with government subsidies, which have largely worked. And we're seeing an increase in investment. We take a look at the opportunities that are presenting themselves, whether it's on infrastructure investment going forward, greening the economy, taking a look at what's happening on technology with Brazil, already the 5th largest internet market in the world, and looking to grow potentially exponentially in terms of new technologies and unicorns in just the coming 12 to 18 months. I would suggest that the negative economic view of what's happening in Brazil needs to be reassessed. There are challenges, the threat to break through the debt ceiling, high and stubborn unemployment rate, and inflation, which, like elsewhere in the world, is beginning to have a serious impact in Brazil. But it's a mixed picture, and on balance, I would suggest it's a picture which still suggests engagement with Brazil and a Brazil moving forward on a host of fronts.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very sanguine assessment. Ambassador Rynick, would you like to offer your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle. I actually agree with very much of what Mike has said. When I look at the current moment, I sort of feel I've read the book, seen the movie. We've been at this point in the Brazil-U.S. relationship many times in the past where it appears that we're not making progress, that things are headed in the wrong direction, that it is a disaster, and somehow we always manage to pull back from the brink. Now, each time this happens, we lose an opportunity to make that progress and to move further in the right direction. But I don't think that we should overestimate how serious this moment is compared to what we have seen before. What I guess I would say more discouraged about, though, is that if you're talking about this strategic partnership, this is not the time to talk in those terms, I think. It's a time to talk about tactical building blocks in a host of areas, some of which are government to government, but many of which are not. And just to think about how we can use those tactical building blocks to eventually one day construct a strategic partnership. What we might keep in mind is that you can use tactical measures as part of a pathway to a broader, more consistent, more strategic relationship if you don't consider them just as one-offs, but actually as those building blocks that can contribute. I do think that if we're going to talk about the present political environment in either country in the global context, that each country needs to recognize a sort of a fundamental reality about the other. Brazilians, and I've been part of this for a long time, saying the United States needs to pay more attention to Brazil. Brazil is more important than the United States generally realizes, but the reality is that Brazil is not the most important relationship for the United States. And it pains me in many ways to say that, but it's a reality that has to be accepted. And so how do we build and that has not changed. That's as true at this political moment as I see it as it has been in the past. But how do we accept that reality and move on? And from the Brazil side to the looking at the U.S., or from the U.S. side looking at Brazil, I think the U.S. has got to finally understand that Brazil is different from most of the countries that it deals with in this hemisphere. That is this difference of scale, difference of similarity with the United States, difference of potential. It's fraught with, to use that word, potential when it comes to talk about Brazil. But I do think if we accepted these realities and said, this is what the situation is right now. U.S. is focused on China. U.S. is focused on Iran. But Brazil, nonetheless, is an energy powerhouse, as we just heard. It's an agricultural powerhouse. Let's recognize the realities, and then let's use our tactical steps to build toward that strategic partnership from both sides.
Thank you, Donna. And to be honest, you've actually sort of teed up beautifully the second question I wanted to pose to both of you. And maybe I'll start with Ambassador McKinley, knowing that Ambassador Rynick has already, I think, led into this a little bit. And that is that, precisely on this theme about how Brazil figures sort of on the Washington agenda. And, the fact that the bilateral relationship has always been an ambitious relationship that has struggled to really remain, I think, relevant, consistently here in Washington. Both of you have spent decades thinking about the bilateral relationship, working to construct a partnership that is strategic and sustainable through political cycles. We are now in the first year of a Biden administration here, in the U.S., which always provides, I think, a natural opportunity to reflect and to recalibrate. We heard earlier today from Ambassador Forster and Jair about the number of growing areas of cooperation, from energy and to the environment to space exploration and technology, et cetera. But as two former diplomats, what advice would you give to the Biden administration as they think through how to chart a path forward with Brazil, keeping in mind, cognizant of all the many different distractions, let's say, that there is on the Washington agenda? Are there productive areas or areas of cooperation or attention that you feel have gone unnoticed, or that we should be focusing on beyond what's currently happening? Maybe I'll start with you, Ambassador McKinley.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to assume that Ambassador Forster and Jair have covered the panoply of areas that the United States and Brazil cooperate on. But I'm going to say that if there's one thing to take away from this half hour, it's what Donna said about tactical versus strategic on the relationship and the historical context. It is absolutely the central definition of U.S.-Brazilian relations. It's not going to change. That said, I really do think it's time for both countries to move, but especially Brazil, from the view that this needs to have an overarching strategic definition beyond the level it already does. And that's because it's a mature, strong bilateral relationship of the kind we have with a number of key European countries with whom we're not engaging in crisis management every day, but just making sure that relationships are sustained. So whether it's on security cooperation, or trying to see where we move on NATO partnerships, what we do in terms of trade facilitation and investment questions, how we cooperate on environmental protection and social programs, all of that already is at a fairly sophisticated level. It just doesn't fit into a neat package. What I would suggest is missing at the moment is notwithstanding the political differences between the administrations. And again, I think the best way to deal with them or factor them in is to accept that they exist. Any number of initiatives continue to move forward. The relationship continues to build in certain important ways. And looking forward, what is it Brazil and the United States have in common over the next 6 to 9 months of the agenda? Well, for a start, there's a very significant shift building in Brazil's approach to the environment. I don't know how far it's going to go, but there's any number of initiatives, funding mechanisms, diplomatic engagements in the coming months in which the multiplier effect of a Brazil engaged on environmental issues cannot be underestimated and can be extremely helpful for the United States as it pursues wider international cooperation. All 3 weeks ago, the articles were all about how Brazil, China, Australia, Russia were looking to soften COP26 declarations. Brazil has just taken itself off that list with the commitments which appear to have been made, which hopefully will be formalized in Glasgow in a week's time. The second area is, frankly, we all have a similar interest in the new rules of the game on world trade, on technology, cybersecurity, on strengthening the WTO again, modernizing it, updating it, but again, seeing how structures and agreements on standards, regulations, arbitration can help to build regional alliances moving forward across the world. And Brazil's is engaged in Asia with China. It's a major trading partner and second or third leading investor inside Brazil. And so cooperation on how to approach on a host of issues significant. what's going to happen in Venezuela after the November elections. But I would suggest it's not necessarily going to be pretty. And Brazil will become in a continent where governments in Peru, Argentina, Mexico, perhaps elsewhere, Chile, shift in how they see Venezuela. Brazil's position may become more central to Washington concerns as they decide policy options going forward. So I would suggest there is an agenda for strengthened engagement, notwithstanding the differences. And that's why I mentioned all the high-level engagements that have taken place. The door hasn't shut to that kind of communication between the two governments.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Rynick, I don't know whether you want to supplement any of your thoughts there on what advice would you give to the Biden administration on Brazil?
Well, I would just say that, Richard Haas wrote a book several years ago called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And I think, both countries have such domestic pressures and such complicated domestic agendas that looking at what we can do together that would actually help each one of the governments at home is a good way to look at this. Mike mentioned cyber. I think cyber crimes affect small people with small bank accounts in Brazil and in the United States. So collaboration in those areas that really affect, I think, that really affect our people. I used to talk about weather when I was in Brazil and say that the NASA-INPE relationship was so important because we focused on things like weather. So I'd look for those areas where we can recognize similar problems and similar opportunities where we can, if you will, sell in the solutions to our domestic audiences.
Thank you, Ambassador. Maybe if I can stay with you and pick a topic that I know you spend a lot of time thinking about these days, and it's a little bit tied to COVID, but it's the return of travel and tourism, to Brazil. Many of us know Brazil to be, such a beautiful country, but the reality is that large swaths of it remain unknown to foreign visitors due to just difficulty of accessing, whether it's by land or by sea. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in your role with Royal Caribbean. What opportunities, first of all, how do you see return to travel, especially for Latin America and Brazil in particular? And what do you see as opportunities for investment in tourism in Brazil? And how are you working with the government in Brazil to help facilitate that opportunity?
A lot of people have said that the biggest problem in generating more tourism from the US to Brazil is the Caribbean. But if you're on a cruise ship, that's not necessarily the case. So from this perspective that I have now, just let me say that, the issues that we have confronted as a company and long before I joined Royal Caribbean are the same that I heard from many US companies when I was representing the US government there, or even when I was there with the private sector. Give you an example, we for a long time had 4 cruise ships a season operating in Brazil. We have not operated in Brazil for 10 years, but we still have 3 lawyers working in Brazil, settling labor disputes. We still have tax issues. So these are the kind, it's the old custo Brasil, right? It's real, we're still paying the cost. That said, we would love to be back in Brazil, particularly once we get beyond COVID, because we do see lots of potential, not just for people from the States, but for Europeans to visit Brazil. You take people, and I'm learning a lot about the cruise industry, but it's not just hitting port cities. There are cruises that obviously dock at the port and then take people inland, so you can visit sites that people never expected to be able to see on a cruise. So I'm had the great good fortune, as I know Mike did too, to travel around Brazil a lot. We were able to see so much of Brazil, and I think we both have an interest in showing it off. I'd love to bring my company down there and get it involved again, but it's not easy for the same reasons that so many companies aren't able to expand their business in Brazil.
I'd love to have this next conversation on one of those cruise lines, Donna, so let us know. Maybe the last word to Ambassador McKinley, and now touching back on to the subject of trade. Since you are a veteran, I think, of overseeing the conclusion of a number of FTAs with Latin America, including Peru and Colombia. And of course, as we all know, Brazil does not yet have a trade agreement with the US. We heard earlier today some of the achievements that were made last year with what we're calling sort of the mini trade deal, the ATEC, but a more ambitious agreement has remained elusive for many, years, and for many reasons, frankly, that are well known to many of us. Looking back at your experience, particularly with Peru and Colombia, what needs to change? What conditions do you see ripe, that were in those markets and with the U.S. at that time, that perhaps could be a lesson learned for the U.S. and Brazil as we consider how to advance on the trade agreement? And do you see any conditions for this in the foreseeable future? Which I think I know the answer to that, but I'll ask it anyway.
So first, let me again join or support or purloin Donna's points on Custo Brazil. As we look ahead at the challenges, I mentioned inflation, debt ceiling, but there is still a panoply of economic reforms that have to be carried out to allow that surge of FDI to come into Brazil, even though Brazil has moved up the charts and is hovering in the top 10 on a regular basis over the last 2, 3, 4 years. So the second point is very much the security and foreign policy begin at home. President Biden's foreign policy for middle-class America, and I think we have some mirror images in Brazil in terms of how Brazil's approaching some critical questions. And I think that's also important to factor in. On the trade environment, I'm going to be, I won't say pessimistic, but I think we need to be realistic and pragmatic. The fact of the matter is the United States has already made a decision, and it goes back to 2015, 2016, in which the final efforts to conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership agreements through 2016 failed. And certainly it didn't become any easier over the succeeding 4 years. There's been a worldwide pullback in some respects from sort of the multilateral, wider regional, intra-regional agreements, and a retreat to focus more on bilateral agreements. In some cases, like Asia, different constellations of Asian countries are still finding a way to work together. Brazil, Argentina, if political differences get resolved, that's why I said political differences cannot be ignored. Hopefully an agreement will be reached for the European Union and enter into effect over the next year or so. Certainly countries continue to look for agreements. The United States is not one of them. And given our domestic environment and given sentiment in Congress and in the wider country, I don't see any initiative forthcoming in the next couple of years on trade. The most common recommendation is for the United States to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's not going to happen, certainly not in a time frame that would be helpful to improving Brazil-US trade ties. So I would suggest the following. There is the need to focus on continuing to sweep away the invisible barriers, the visible barriers to trade and investment, which may be on both sides, but are largely, I think, in Brazil's bailiwick to address at this stage of the game. And second, a tremendous amount of effort that can be put into regulatory, not oversight, but regulatory sort of meshing, coming to agreement on standards, on a host of products, coming to an agreement on technology. And in that case, I think we're going to find out very soon with the Huawei, with a bid in November for 5G, what decisions Brazil takes. But looking forward and being optimistic, technology is another area where there's very significant cooperation. And given what Brazil is spending, and whatever happens, there's going to be a spending bill passed in the US Congress. There's going to be synergies in terms of international engagement on greening global economies and looking for opportunities there. So I would suggest this isn't static and it doesn't depend on a trade agreement. It would be great to have one, but Brazil's not at this point being discriminated against. The atmosphere inside Washington at the moment is not propitious for reaching formalized trade agreements with any part of the world.
Yeah, thanks for that realistic perspective, Ambassador. I think our panel is out of time. I just wanted to see whether perhaps Ambassador Rynick had any final words she wanted to impart. No pressure if you don't, but just as we conclude here.
I guess if I had one message to send, I would just say, repeat what I said at the beginning, don't despair. I think the potential for partnership on a host of issues that are really relevant to all of us every day is great. And I think we just need to keep pursuing that.
Thank you. And I totally agree. You can never despair if you are a lover and follower of Brazil. Well, that concludes our panel. I want to thank to both of you, and I will turn it over to Ann McKinney, I believe, for introduction for the next panel. Thank you very much to both of you.
Take care.
Take care.
Good afternoon. And our program will now turn to the topic of the bilateral commercial agenda, which, as we've heard today, is a top priority for the business community and a longstanding focus of the U.S. Brazil Business Council. Prior to the pandemic and the global economic downturn in 2020, U.S.-Brazil two-way trade in goods and services in 2019 reached slightly more than $104 billion. And although we saw a downturn in 2020, we're seeing encouraging signs that this year will close with a rebound in two-way trade. We heard from our private sector panel examples of optimism and the progress that they've seen on the U.S.-Brazil commercial agenda. And to continue this conversation and take a deep dive on some of the top priorities for the commercial agenda, I'm delighted to welcome Dale Tasharsky, the Deputy Director of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service, who currently serves as Acting Director General and Acting Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets. Dale oversees Global Markets' extensive network of trade and investment and policy professionals located in offices across the United States, around the globe, and in Washington, D.C., who assist and advocate for U.S. businesses in international markets. As a career foreign service officer, Dale has helped advance U.S. commercial interests at posts overseas, including Germany, India, Ireland, and Japan, at U.S. field offices, where he first joined the commercial service a number of years ago, and also at headquarters in leadership positions in Washington. Dale, thank you so much for joining us today.
And it's great to be here. Thank you.
It's good to see you again. And we're going to jump right into the conversation about the bilateral commercial agenda. The Brazil-U.S. economic relationship, as we've heard, is supported by a robust set of economic dialogues, government-to-government dialogues, and cooperation in diverse sector. One great example of this is the U.S.-Brazil commercial dialogue, which is an important example of how the two governments are working together to strengthen trade relations through regular exchanges on a wide range of issues like trade facilitation, which, as we've heard from our member companies, is so important, as well as good regulatory practices, the digital economy standards, among other issues. These bilateral dialogues are also an important framework for the private sector to share their expertise and engage with both governments on policy priorities. The Commerce Department and your counterparts at Brazil's Ministry of Economy held the plenary session of the U.S.-Brazil Commercial Dialogue just last week. So I wanted to see if you'd be able to share a few of the key takeaways with us ahead of, I know, a full-scale briefing that you're planning to do for companies later this week, and also talk about the ways that the Commerce Department is advancing the Biden administration's trade agenda.
And thank you. It's great to be here. It's absolutely fantastic to see you. It's been a long time and have a chance to chat with you today. And I want to thank the U.S. Chamber and the Brazil-U.S. Business Council as well for the invitation to be here. And when we think about the commercial dialogue, which, as you mentioned, just happened, the preliminary session just happened, we think about what's new, what's coming down the pike. But I want to start by saying basically what is not new. The U.S.-Brazil commercial dialogue is one of the longest lasting, and I think it's fair to say most active bilateral dialogues that we have. And it's unique in its longevity and its productivity, and really in the depth and breadth of its agenda. And Anne, this is testament to the strength of our commercial relationship and to the effectiveness of our dialogue. And frankly, and importantly, it really reflects the dedication of everyone who's here today. You know, I think the commercial dialogue has really never been more important, particularly as we spur economic recovery following the challenges of the pandemic. And the dialogue's work also supports Biden administration's priorities related to economic recovery, and that include inclusiveness and the equitable aspects of that recovery. And it supports the administration's climate agenda. And in terms of results, last week's plenary, the team set forth an ambitious agenda for the rest of this year and the next year. And first and foremost was the historic U.S. Brazil protocols on trade rules and transparency. And as you may know, these feature good regulatory practices, trade facilitation, and business ethics. The protocols really serve as a model for other agreements in the hemisphere, and we expect them to improve transparency and the ability to do business throughout the region. Now, we recognize, of course, and that the Brazilian Congress needs to ratify the protocols. But in the meantime, of course, we're working to support Brazil's implementation, and we're looking ahead to future work. And our dialogue team itself will continue its work on trade in the digital economy, on standards and conformity assessment, in areas like good regulatory practices and IPR, and of course on trade facilitation. But there are some new topics, and we're adding the topic of express delivery to the trade facilitation agenda. And we're also considering trade in remanufactured goods. And behind all this, of course, we've asked our working groups to incorporate the issue of climate change into all their work streams. You know, President Biden has made clear that addressing climate change is one of the administration's top priorities. And we believe that the work of the commercial dialogue can actually help address this priority by doing a few things, by protecting innovators, by easing regulatory burdens, and by spurring sustainable trade.
Thank you, Dale. And I know our members will be pleased to learn about the addition of express delivery and remanufacturing to the commercial dialogue agenda. I don't know if you were on earlier, I know you had a meeting, but some of our members were talking about the boring but necessary policy work as really essential to keeping this relationship healthy and moving. And so I hesitate to call it boring, but it's definitely important work that you're doing through the commercial dialogue. And so we appreciate all of that good work.
That's right. We know that working hard.
Yeah, we know that investment is an important element of the U.S. Brazil bilateral relationship that helps create jobs, stimulate exports, and really foster innovation in both countries. The U.S. is the largest source of FDI in Brazil, and we're continuing to see an increasing number of Brazilian companies that are growing their business by making direct investments, both greenfield and through acquisitions in the United States. So I wonder if you could tell us about some of the trends you're seeing, and if you have any success stories that you'd like to share with us.
You know, Anne, you're absolutely right. Bilateral investment is a very positive element of the U.S.-Brazil relationship. And as you probably know, the current stock of Brazilian-owned investment in the United States stands at more than $44 billion. So that's pretty significant. It also supports more than 95,000 American jobs across a range of industries. These jobs that these companies support are dynamic, they're competitive jobs, and they're spread across the United States in different areas like aerospace and IT and professional services and manufacturing. But I should also, I think, point out that tech-based industries are an important source of investment from Brazil. And over the past 5 years, we've seen solid investments from companies from all branches of the tech sector, which typically lead to really competitive and high-paying jobs. And Brazilian fintech firms, in particular, seem to have a huge appetite to invest in the United States. And over the course of, I think, this past year, a number of Brazilian fintech firms have launched U.S. IPOs and opened offices here. You know, and you're going to recognize this, but I have to do a little bit of a commercial here because one of the best tools we have to promote this kind of activity in the United States is our annual Select USA Investment Summit. And year on year, we see a stronger delegation of Brazilian investors exploring investment opportunities in the United States. And the next investment summit, if you've got your pencils ready, is scheduled to be held in person from June 26th through 29th in 2022, just outside of Washington, D.C. The registration is going to open in November, and we look forward, of course, to hosting another large Brazilian delegation.
Well, thanks, Dale. And we'll certainly allow you to make that type of commercial, and I hope that our audience was able to jot down those dates. And it's excellent that the next Select USA Investment Summit will be in person. That's exciting news. And it's a terrific opportunity really for sort of a one-stop shop to look at all that the amazing opportunities that the US has to offer. So you mentioned earlier the Trade Rules and Transparency Protocol, and which is really bringing state-of-the-art discipline to customs and trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, and anti-corruption measures. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more sort of in the spirit of the cooperation that's taking place. We did hear the good news that the agreement passed the lower house of the Brazilian Congress, so it appears it's moving forward to the Senate. So we know that it still that it's on its way to its final ratification in Brazil, but I wonder if you could give us a few highlights about the cooperation that we expect to see and how it relates to some of the existing cooperation in customs and good regulatory practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point to make, and I should probably I must take an opportunity in a moment to congratulate Brazil on the great strides it's taken in the area of good regulatory practices, or as we like to say in the government, GRPs. Brazil passed the Economic Freedom Act back in 2019 and issued several regulatory decrees that implemented GRPs. These included a decree to improve regulatory impact analyses, which gives private sector entities the ability to petition to review an outdated regulation, taking into account relevant international standards. And these are welcome steps toward creating quality regulations and adopting approaches that promote trade and innovation. We've shared our experience implementing GRPs as Brazil prepares for its reforms and begins to implement measures. In fact, just this morning, we held an exchange where U.S. regulators from the FDA, from EPA, along with representatives from NIST and our Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, they all got together to share best practices on conducting risk assessments. And we know that implementing GRPs is a process of continual improvement. And I can say that we look forward to future opportunities to share experiences.
Thanks, Dale. One of the common themes that we've heard during today's event is really how the global priorities of climate and sustainability are such a critical part of the strategic U.S.-Brazil relationship. Energy is another area where the Commerce Department has played, an important role actively helping U.S. companies bring their products and services to global markets. And yesterday, we understand that the Commerce Department, that you all organized the U.S.-Brazil Green Grid Summit to discuss bilateral cooperation to help achieve climate goals. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and where you see additional opportunities for collaboration and what the private sector can do to contribute to this work.
Right. Yeah. Climate and sustainability are incredibly important, but they're complex. And they cover many sectors, and there are a lot of cross-cutting elements that you need to consider as well. And when you think about it, there's really no shortage of work to be done in this space. So as a result, there are many real areas of possible collaboration between Brazil and the United States. And as you said yesterday, the U.S. Brazil Green Grid Summit. At that summit, we witnessed the launch of a new partnership between EPRI and LACTEC, which are the preeminent research institutions in the United States and Brazil. And their partnership focuses on the electric power sector. And they have plans to collaborate in a range of technical areas. This is the first of what we think will be several partnerships that we hope to see as we innovate to meet our climate goals. For example, we think there's an opportunity to collaborate as well on development in the Amazon region. There are some things that come to mind, like green energy, including off-power grid solutions and biofuels, as well as energy efficiency, climate resilience, and adaptation solutions. But they're just a few of the many possibilities that might exist, some of which we have yet to even conceive. And you asked the question, what about the private sector? Well, that's really where the private sector comes in. We want to hear from the private sector about what we should prioritize. And for example, what specific climate sustainability issues and sectors would bring the most benefit to our companies and frankly, to the planet. So, Anne, this is a reach back to you. We welcome your thoughts. and any of those of the chamber and its membership as well. This is an important topic, and we look for as much contribution from the private sector as we can attain.
Well, thank you, Dale. And I know that our team with the Brazil-U.S. Business Council and our member companies will be taking you up on that invitation to provide input because it's an important area of our work. We're running close to the end of the time we have for this session, but I'd like to invite you, in a minute or two to give us a few closing thoughts on where you see the bilateral commercial agenda.
Right, thank you, Ann. I'd be delighted to do so. The Department of Commerce and the Ministry of Economy have a deep and a really very active partnership. It's founded on a mutual goal of growing bilateral trade and investment. And in fact, the events over the past few weeks provided a snapshot to the strength and dynamism of that relationship. Just to recap, and this is just again over the last 3 weeks, on October 7th, Brazil hosted the U.S. Brazil CEO Forum joint preparation meeting to plan for what will be a February CEO Forum. On October 13th, our Deputy Secretary of Commerce, Don Graves, met in person with Deputy Minister of Economy, Roberto Fent, to discuss plans for the forum, as well as the commercial dialogue and objectives for the Summit of the Americas. And then a week later, on October 20th, Acting Undersecretary for International Trade, Diane Farrell, met with Secretary for Foreign Trade, Lucas Feijas, and on October 22nd, they co-chaired the 19th, that would be the 19th, actually, plenary of the U.S. Brazil Commercial Dialogue. It's been a long-standing dialogue, as we can see. But this week, we have, of course, the U.S. Brazil Green Grid Summit and a future participation of our Deputy Secretary and other commerce leadership. And then on Friday, Acting Undersecretary Farrell and Secretary Feijas will again have an opportunity to meet and give a detailed readout of the commercial dialogue to be hosted by AmCham Brazil. And so finally, on November 3rd, our Acting Undersecretary and again her counterpart will speak to the Brazil-California Chamber. And in addition, there's numerous technical workshops and webinars that are taking place. So that's really a long list of activities to enumerate in a conversation like this. But I really it really does make a point. And I wanted to make that point. And that list, reflects the strength and the dynamism of our commercial relationship with Brazil. And it's one that is focused on working together to grow bilateral trade and investment. And Commerce is proud to lead the U.S. Brazil CEO Forum in partnership with our National Economic Council. And we use the U.S. Brazil Commercial Dialogue and the U.S. Brazil Defense Industry Dialogue, as well as our role in other interagency engagements, to respond to the joint recommendations that come from the U.S. and Brazilian CEOs. And we're excited to be planning an in-person CEO Forum for this February, where we plan to demonstrate progress in addressing those joint recommendations. Now, CEO members have confirmed their interest in addressing a wide range of topics, including sustainability, health, education and workforce development, supply chain resiliency, and infrastructure. So, Ann, to close, I just want to thank you and the Chamber for giving me an opportunity to join you today. The Commerce Department and the Ministry of Economy have a solid relationship, as I've said, and we have an ambitious agenda. And together, I think we can foster an environment that supports our business communities and one that will grow our economies. And I want to thank the business community for its ongoing support of our work on your behalf, because you please continue to let us know what challenges you face and what the United States and Brazil can do as business partners within our commercial relationship to support you.
Thank you so much, Dale, for joining us today and for really sharing all of those examples about the way that the relationship continues to advance and progress and strengthen by strong partnerships between the Department of Commerce and your counterparts at the Ministry of Economy. And on behalf of the business community, we would like to thank you and your team here in Washington and Brazil and really across the United States for the work that you do on a daily basis to support the business community and to help strengthen the U.S. Brazil commercial agenda. So thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing to work together.
Thank you, Ann. Good to see you.
And now I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Neil Harrington, Senior Vice President for the Americas at the U.S. Chamber, to continue our conversation on building a strategic partnership between the United States and Brazil. Neil?
it helps to unmute before you start speaking in the session. I'm so privileged. I hope everybody can hear me now, but and there was a terrific session with Dale, and I think it really summarized well just how active the bilateral economic agenda is. So I'm really pleased to be able to host the final panel of the day, because it allows us to be joined by two very good friends of the business community, both the U.S. business community and the Brazilian business community. Ricardo Zúñiga is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle at the State Department. And Ambassador Pedro Miguel da Costa de Silva is Secretary for Bilateral and Regional Negotiations in the Americas at Itamaraty. Over the years, the Chamber has had the privilege of working closely with Ricardo on a variety of hemispheric issues, most recently in addressing the root causes of migration in the Northern Triangle. His work across the region has included distinguished service as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for West Ham Affairs. And very important to this discussion, service as our U.S. Consul General in Sao Paulo. So he is someone who has intimate knowledge of the bilateral relationship. Pedro Miguel is very well known to all of us in the private sector, because as Brazil's lead negotiator of the ATEC, which we've talked a lot about today, he tirelessly engaged us both in Washington and Brazil ahead of the agreement's completion, which we were very proud, a lot of you will remember, that it was announced in conjunction with last year's Brazil Connect Summit. So it really is no exaggeration to say no one deserves more credit for its successful negotiation than Pedro Miguel does, along with our great friend and his good friend, I know, Daniel Watson. But like Ricardo, Pedro Miguel has a broad regional portfolio. So he has also been very helpful to us in the last 18 months in joining with some of his other regional diplomatic colleagues in providing us guidance on government response to critical issues like supply chain disruption in our region and preservation of essential services. So as all of you know, today's great sessions have covered a host of different elements in the bilateral relationship, but the aim of this session is to dig a little bit deeper with our diplomatic experts and representatives on some of the front burner issues like pandemic recovery. So I'm very pleased to turn things over to both Ricardo and Pedro Miguel for some opening remarks, but would first invite all of you to post any questions in the chat, as both of our guests have kindly offered to take a few questions after they speak. So with that, Ricardo, thank you again for being with us. The floor is yours.
Neil, thank you so much, and thank you for doing the unmute thing, because I would guarantee you I would have done it myself had we not had you run the test for us. So, thank you very much to the Brazil-U.S. Business Council for organizing this terrific event. This feels very much like home territory for me. As I was listening, I think I must have been. I'm sure I was among the few people who was really smiling about the description of express delivery being added to the agenda and being excited by that, because the boring stuff is exactly what matters to our work here. That is real progress. So a salute to everyone working on these. It's also great to be here with Ambassador Costa Silva, and just wonderful to see him again. Look, events like this and the conversation that we just heard, the description we just heard from Dale, really brings home the common interest that we share between the United States and Brazil. These really are remarkably active trade relationships. I think during the time that I was Consul General in Sao Paulo, I think people were very surprised by how much of our work went into promoting Brazilian investment in the United States, but you can see why. The convergence between our economic interests is so vast, and the energy that exists between our entrepreneurs is so important that we understand that our job is to facilitate that kind of relationship. Strategic partnership is exactly the word that we were happy to see as a topic of discussion, because that's how we see the relationship with Brazil. We're not just the two largest democracies and economies in the Americas. We are countries that find ourselves in many parts of the world working together and collaborating on issues that are important to our societies. The fact is that we see Brazil's role in the world, not just in the Americas, as vital to U.S. National success as well. And just as we hope our activities are building the kind of world where Brazilians want to live. Brazil was one of the very first stops for our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, when he traveled in August, and I accompanied him along with Juan Gonzalez, the senior director for the Americas at the NSC. And then Jake Sullivan hosted National Security Advisor Sullivan hosted Admiral Flavio Rocha in the White House very recently for a week-long series of meetings earlier this month, and I had a chance to join in those conversations as well. As part of that, Jake Sullivan expressed support for Brazil's OECD aspirations, which we continue to support and back and see as important for the global economy. In addition to that, Secretary Blinken had excellent meetings with Minister França at the UN General Assembly, and our teams are working very closely preparing for the G20 and COP26 meetings next week. So we also, and very importantly, are looking forward to working with Brazil as it joins the UN Security Council beginning in January for a 2-year term. We have found ourselves excellent partners in past terms and look forward to that as well. But to the topic of this discussion, from taxes to agriculture to space cooperation, we really do cooperate on real world issues that affect our societies, our economies, our people, and in practical ways that make us even closer strategic partners. I mentioned that we see Brazil in many other parts of the world. We've worked with them very closely on matters related to migration, on matters related to law enforcement, on matters related to the global climate change, which I know is another subject that's important to this conversation today. Our cooperation at the UN Security Council, as I mentioned, is going to deepen our work on global priorities that are facing our countries today as we try to emerge from the pandemic. And I'm sure that other parts of the conversation have touched on this, but one of the important things that we talked about during National Security Advisor Sullivan's trip to Brazil was the role of Brazil as a producer of vaccines, as using that enormous capacity to supply so much of the rest of the region in Africa. We're very glad to see climate, as I mentioned, as one of the themes of today's summit, because we also see this as a top priority for U.S. foreign policy and a critical area of cooperation with Brazil. Addressing climate change is a whole of government effort for this administration. We know it's also the case for Brazil, and we support the ambitious pledges made by Brazil this year at April's Leaders Summit on Climate. We also very much welcomed President Bolsonaro's commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, zero illegal deforestation by 2030, and doubling the deforestation enforcement budget. Brazil this week unveiled the National Green Growth Program to attract climate-related investment, which everywhere we go, we're finding is an area that attracts enormous interest from the private sector. We look forward to more forward-leaning announcements and getting deeply into the details at the implementation of the commitments in Glasgow next week. But what we already do is have an extensive environmental exchange at the scientific level, at the researcher level, bilateral cooperation with U.S. Geological Survey, NASA, Environmental Protection Agency. Many of these I got to see in Brazil firsthand in Sao Paulo, that extensive technical collaboration between our scientists that feeds into what we find is to be the kind of the leading issues on technology of the day. One example is the Partnership for Conservation of Amazon Biodiversity. It's a multi-year, $130 million bilateral agreement to strengthen Brazil's vast protected areas, including indigenous territories, to support sustainable and forest-friendly supply chains, value chains rather, and to foster private sector leadership and engagement in finding solutions for exactly these parts of the country. Our economic relationship is extremely important. We look for ways to expand trade beyond our countries. We see that we are rebounding from the dip that accompanied the recessions and the related to the pandemic. And as I said frequently in Sao Paulo, the real value of the relationship from our perspective for Brazil is that their trade with us is for value-added products and that help diversify the Brazilian economy in important ways, just as Brazilian investment in the United States helps diversify our economy in the United States. And we believe that U.S. investment in Brazil helps do the same. We're creating jobs in each other's countries in true form of partnership. I know we're going to continue to look for ways to boost that. There was a lot of discussion already of the agreement on trade and economic cooperation on ATEC and the need and the desire to see the ratification of this by the Congress in Brazil, which we know is an important part of how we're trying to facilitate trade between our countries. On 5G, which is an important part of our conversations as well with Brazil, we know that this is part of the infrastructure development that we believe is going to be important going forward for both countries. We're obviously very interested in following Brazil's upcoming spectrum auction and deployment with critical infrastructure and sensitive data entrusted to wireless network operators and equipment. Our view is that we need to ensure that these networks are secure and ensure that the future networks support the speed and convenience without sacrificing security and user confidence. We believe and have made mention of the fact that a solution that we believe is very promising going forward is open radio access networks, Open RAN systems that are industry-led and we believe have a lot of room for expansion in the future. With Brazil's major 5G spectrum auction coming up next week, likely the largest in the world, O-RAN technology is going to put Brazil at the forefront of innovation in the region with knock-on benefits for a host of industries that rely on fast, secure internet. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to stop there and probably already exceeded my time. But as you know, this is something that I think personally believe is really critical to both countries. Just in closing, I would say that this economic relationship is something where we have an intense interest in seeing all of the work that Dale described make progress so that in particular in this moment, we can create greater opportunity in both countries.
Ricardo, I think you used your time optimally. I think it was what you reinforced for all of us is I think what's been a recurring theme today, which is let's get beyond the headlines sometimes to realize just how robust the bilateral partnership is across the board. Love your comment on value add products. It's, as you know better than I do, it's not something you can say about all the markets we partner with in the region, and it's a really, really important point. Obviously, we're all following closely what comes out of COP26 and how we as the private sector can contribute. And then, I think we might have a chance to dig a little deeper later on OECD, because your words are extremely encouraging on OECD and the Biden administration's focus on that. So thank you for that. Without further ado, I want to turn to our very good friend, Pedro Miguel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you again to the Brazil-U.S. Business Council for this invitation to be here at the 2021 edition of the U.S. Brazil Connect Summit. And it's a pleasure to be here with Ricardo Zuniga. I think he did all the job that I had thought. I don't know what the expression is in English. He stole my thunder. So I have very little to add. I agree with most of what he said. And listening to him and to the very complete presentation that he made, just a few things came up that in my mind. And you know me, I'm very direct. Sometimes I'm accused of not being very diplomatic. It happens to some diplomats. And listening to you mentioning the expression going beyond or moving beyond the headlines, I thought about one expression that I used couple of weeks ago when I was in Washington with a U.S. authority, and I said, keep your eye on the ball. Don't be distracted by the spectators or the noise around you. And then listening to Ricardo, since I like music, I thought about another image, which is put on the noise canceling of the headphones, listen just to the music. So that would be my first message here to this event and to this meeting. We hear a lot about the bilateral relations between the United States and Brazil and the problems and the difficulties. And I said something similar an hour ago in an event between Brazil and Argentina, another event that I participated. Just keep your eyes on the ball, put the noise canceling on, and look at the reality. Ricardo went through most of the issues. I will start, like he said, he made an interesting comment, the boring ones. And there are a few boring ones that I don't think he mentioned. One is global entry, which when it comes into effect, and even if it's still in a small scale, will be very beneficial to our business sectors. The other one is mutual recognition agreements. And if we want to facilitate trade, that's another important tool to make things move along faster. Of course, we were talking about the regional value chains, and I think that the United States will have a very good opportunity next year in the Summit of the Americas to present something very bold in terms of the plan that they have. It's very difficult to think about sustainable development in the Americas if we don't talk about these new regional global chains. And to speak plainly, this means investment in the region and generating new trade opportunities and job opportunities for everybody, because this will evidently tackle some of the very complicated issues that we face, such as migration. It's one of the elements that we have to take into consideration. But I had a shopping list as long as Ricardo of all the issues that I think that are what I as a civil servant see as the backbone of our bilateral relationship, beyond the issues of the moment, beyond contentious issues that are very important to both sides. We need to build an agenda that keeps moving in different administrations on both sides. And this has to include issues such as energy, such as defense and defense cooperation, security, strategic minerals, trade and investments, science and technology, and I could go on. And these are the issues that we need to keep on working on a permanent basis, because these are the issues that interest our business communities, our societies, and that they don't depend only on what government we have in place. And I think that this is something that I, even though I also represent the Brazilian government, I think that we have to build things that are very stable in time and that have an opportunity to grow, and that they don't need to change every 2 years or every 4 years. So that, I think, would be my message. Having said that, I completely agree with Ricardo's assessment that we are going through a very good and productive stage. We are in tune in many issues, be them what we want to build bilaterally, but also in the region. He spoke of several issues of the region. I would speak also about the issues of democracy and preservation of regional institutions. We work that with different countries, but we work together very well at the OAS, for example, and international fora. He mentioned what we're going to do in the UN, but I can also point to a series of other international fora where we're working together well, hand in hand with the United States, such, for example, as the WTO. And I could go on, but I think it would be more interesting to go into a dialogue and the questions and answers period of this part of your seminar. I just want to say that we work here always with the glass half full perspective of our bilateral relations, and we work hard on a positive perspective to move ahead, because I think that is important for our countries and to generate mutually beneficial results. Thank you.
Again, just like Ricardo, extremely well said, Pedro Miguel. Thank you so much. I think we'll move. I love the recurring theme of kind of the boring being where everything is getting done. Maybe I'll change the metaphor to something very American and talk about we'll say the blocking and tackling in American football parlance, right? It's the blocking and tackling that the two sides, both private and public sectors, are doing every day, which is really what this relationship, the economic relationship, has thrived on since its inception. You hit on a bunch of issues on my list. I think you gave me the perfect segue into the first question. If we can talk a little bit about some pandemic recovery, dig a little deeper. It is the question on everyone's mind. And just this morning, we in the private sector had the opportunity to meet with Undersecretary of State Fernandez, Ricardo's colleague. He called us together as private sector stakeholders to begin to plan for the Summit of the Americas next year. And the overwhelming consensus was that the regional private sector and governments have to collaborate closely to drive an inclusive and sustainable regional recovery. So some might argue there's no better place to start than with the region's two largest economies. I wonder if you could both talk, and maybe Pedro Miguel, I'll start with you this time. talk, if you would, about the steps the U.S. and Brazil could potentially take to help lead the region's recovery, whether it's enhanced vaccine access, building health infrastructure, et cetera. Really interested in your thoughts.
Thank you very much. You didn't even give me time to drink water.
We're efficient.
I think that you mentioned very good examples. I think that the one venue that is fundamental, as I said, is the private sectors, the CEO forum, our enterprises and firms coming together to see what they can and they want to do together. We already have talks between firms from both countries on the issue of vaccine production. I think that both the United States have strength as governments and as administrations in terms of what we have been doing in terms of response to the pandemic. You all know the strength of the Brazilian health system in terms of capacity of vaccination and dealing with the challenges of the Brazilian territory and Brazilian reality. I think that you also mentioned, as I said in the beginning, the issue of the Summit of the Americas. We have a lot of expectations of what our hosts, United States, are going to present. And we will fully support that when Mr. Sullivan was here, the NSA was here in Brazil, and I had the pleasure of meeting with Ricardo. I remember saying that we fully supported their preliminary ideas for the summit, and that we could work together on that. And of course, whatever we can do more in terms of trade and investment facilitation and generating investments and partnerships between our two countries and other countries of the region, obviously, will be very beneficial. Now, I'll finish with this. Just by coincidence, Brazil has the pro-tempore presidency of Mercosur. And one of the issues that we are discussing is exactly the production of vaccines in Mercosur, joint production. And we are organizing a series of events on that, not only between governments, but we are putting together the private sector of our four countries to discuss this. Just to give an illustration, we do not always have to reinvent the wheel. This is the kind of example of things that we can do with the United States and with other countries. Thank you.
Very, very good points. Thank you very much for that. Obviously, music to our ears that you support a robust trade agenda in concert with the summit and beyond. Ricardo, your thoughts?
Well, I think this time it was Pedro Miguel's turn to steal my thunder, because I think he hit it exactly right. The most important thing that we can do here is help put people back to work. And one is an area that Pedro Miguel hit first, which is the U.S. vaccine policy and efforts to collaborate through COVAX and through other mechanisms, and to work with other producers, is precisely aimed at helping put people back to work in safe conditions so that people can help fuel that recovery. So that's part one. The second part is doing everything we can based on, take this emergency and use it to good, use it for something good. So let's remove those barriers to trade and growth. And let's, on the part of the United States, a large part of our agenda in the Americas is going to be built around the Build Back a Better World initiative, which is really the White House signature effort to take a more strategic and deliberate use of our financing mechanisms, not just the Development Finance Corporation, although that's an important player, but certainly our role in multilateral development banks and others, to take a look at directing investments to the extent we can in areas that we know are going to help build sustainable growth over time. So taking investing in people, counting that as part of our infrastructure, which is already, Brazil already does that through a very active vaccine program that was well in place prior to the pandemic. But beyond that, looking at infrastructure that is going to take advantage of the kind of the boom in renewables, and so do two things at once: help us on the climate agenda, but also in ways that are actually creating and facilitating job growth. we need to do this at a broader regional level as well. And seeing what we can do on supply chains is an absolutely vital part of this. We talk a lot about nearshoring, friendshoring, all the variations you want. We understand completely that this requires deliberate measures. I mean, I think there was, in an earlier presentation, there was, I think, a very clear, I think, conversation related to the trade policy in the United States right now. But at the same time, I think there's also a very strong support in Congress and strong support within the executive for doing what we can to ensure that our supply chain needs match our development needs, which are based on stimulating broad-based economic growth.
It's a subject we're focused on every single day. Couldn't agree with you more, Ricardo. I mean, I think that's why it is something that we're very happy the Hill is involved in. We're happy you are focused on it in the administration, and it's going to be critical to not just to ensuring safe and secure supply and constant and consistent supply of goods to the U.S., but to growth in our region, right? To inclusive growth in our region. So thank you for that. Let me turn to the subject of migration, if that's okay, both of you. Good things happening. Another area I think of really encouraging collaboration. Last week, as Ricardo knows well, I'm sure Pedro Miguel knows well too, Secretary Blinken was in Bogota to help President Duque host a regional migration summit. The Secretary and Minister França had extensive phone conversations, I think, in connection with the summit. I would talk, if you would, and Ricardo, I'll start with you. Talk, if you would, about the collaboration between the two countries in assisting vulnerable migrants in Venezuela and coming from Haiti now, obviously, it's something you're very focused on. Is there a joint plan of action to address the crisis? Talk about some of the measures that might be being taken.
So, Neil, thanks. I think that's really a critical point. There is, we are working in the direction of having a regional response to what is now a really unprecedented moment in terms of the numbers of people moving across so many borders so quickly, really from Chile all the way to the U.S. Southwest border. We need to recognize a couple of things first. The United States, certainly we face very large numbers of people making irregular crossings across our border. We're not the destination for the largest number of irregular migrants in the Americas. It's other regions in South America are the destination for Venezuelan migration right now. And Brazil's role really stands out as a country that has performed incredibly well and has demonstrated what can be done to support vulnerable populations. And in terms of resettlement of Venezuelans, a long-standing commitment to Haitians who settled in Brazil as well. There have been extensive conversations because we share, we are both transit and destination countries for irregular migration, and we also border countries where there is large-scale migration underway. So but now you can say that about almost any country in South America and Central America. We are all part of this massive global movement of people. That's the defining dynamic of the moment across the world. It's part of a natural reaction in some ways to both the economic crisis because of the pandemic and where recoveries are taking place. So at different points, different countries are going to become magnets for migration because they're creating opportunity. So, and where opportunity disappears, we're going to see mass displacement. So we have to have systems in place. This is, I think, Brazil and the United States. It's critical for our two countries to work together to help stimulate a response that both provides for the protection needs of vulnerable people, but also ensures that countries are able to enforce their laws and have orderly and legal and humane migration mechanisms in place across the region. Because if we don't do this together, we're going to continue to be vulnerable to these very sudden, massive flows that are beyond the ability of any single immigration system to handle at one time. And we know that in the case of, without going into specifics, we know that xenophobia is an increasing issue, unfortunately, across the region because people are, they see it's connected to the suffering that people are going through as a result of the pandemic. It's also in our interest to ensure that migrants are treated with dignity and respect. We have had that very good relationship, long-standing relationship with Brazil on that score, trying to ensure that we work together with our other partners in the region to make sure that we are able to contend with this. And again, just to close on this, I think we recognize the single largest driver of mass migration right now is lack of opportunity, whether that's caused by dictatorial governance or for economic or pandemic-related reasons. It's really people looking for a better life, and so we respect that, and I think we're very happy to have Brazil as partners in this effort.
Again, well said, and something you personally are working on daily in the Northern Triangle, and we're grateful for that.
I did also want just one last thing. I did want to thank very much Minister France's intervention and collaboration last week in Bogota was very much appreciated by Secretary Blinken, and they did have good conversations in the context of.
That's terrific. Pedro Miguel, your thoughts on migration collaboration?
Thank you very much. Very, very little to add since I have just heard an expert on the matter speak about it. I would completely agree that we have a very good collaboration historically, not just now. Like the United States, Brazil has a tradition of receiving migrants, whatever their status, and I don't know the word in English, we call it in Portuguese, regularizar, which is to legalize or normalize their status and give them all the rights that they have as Brazilians, just like Brazilian citizens. And we have done that with the Venezuelans and with our friends from Haiti. And we have done that in the past with Bolivians. So we have a tradition. This is unnecessary to say, but I will say it. It's a very complex and delicate issue. And both the United States have their legislations, and both of them have to look at the different aspects of this process, which involves not only the issues of migration, but humanitarian issues and the views of all parties, including the views of the migrants. So it's a very delicate situation and topic, which involves, I understand, both in the United States, but I can speak of Brazil, a very long list of actors internally that are interested in the matter and have a say and want to participate in the process. So taking into consideration all those factors, we are constantly in a dialogue with the United States to find the best ways to cooperate and work together on this file. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to sum up, I think you both hit on two things we've heard, two really important points we've heard from regional heads of state recently. One, it's the time to act is now. We heard that from President Cortizo. We can't delay any longer, just like with climate. And from President Duque, we heard the solution has to be regional, and it's a theme that you both are echoing, and I think it's really, really important. We're almost out of time. You've been immensely generous with your time, but let me just, if I could get in 30 seconds from each of you on, Ricardo, again, pivoting back to OECD Accession. It's something you know well. We've been focused on in the private sector at the Chamber, really advocating for Brazil's accession. Very encouraging what you said. Quick words from both of you on what you see as potential next steps, and if you could, I know it's hard, but maybe forecasting timing of Brazil's accession. Ricardo,
so I'm not going to do that. I won't forecast timing. I will not do that. Yes. So since I can't even predict the results of football games, I certainly will not do this one. So I will. Let me just say this. The reason that Jake Sullivan made that point and made our support very clear is because we believe, again, for OECD is made better by Brazil's inclusion, and it is good for Brazil as well. And what's good for Brazil is good for the United States. So that's like full stop what is important for us right here. So I think that the mechanics of how that happens are extremely complex. This is an international organization. and that there are many, many players, and it has its own dynamics that we recognize and support. We've said that we certainly we've collaborated a lot on what we think are messages that are helpful to that dynamic. And so that is where I would say we are. We've talked and shared information and believe that it is in the interest of both the United States and Brazil for Brazil to be to accede to the OECD and to go through the process of accession.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna quit my aspirations to be a journalist since I couldn't get you to bite on that timing question. Totally understandable, but seriously, in all seriousness, we could not agree with you more. It's in Brazil's best interest, and so it becomes in the private sector's interest in terms of really advancing the reform, the market-oriented reform agenda that this government, that Pedro Miguel and his colleagues have been so focused on. Very important. Pedro Miguel, your thoughts.
I was one of the drafters of the letter requesting the initiation of accession procedures to the OECD. I don't remember if it was 2017 or 18. But here we are in 2021, and we haven't even started the process. It's important for those participating in this event that we're not talking about accession. We're talking about the initiation of a very long and complicated process in which the members of the OECD get to ask all they want out of Brazil. So there are, for me, two great mysteries in the universe. One is why we can't get this process started, because I think it's in the interest, like you said, of Brazil, but also of all the OECD member states, because we already are the country outside of membership that have adopted the greatest number of OECD directives and recommendations, which is, I think, a clear signal. But anyhow, one of the mysteries is this one, and the other one has nothing to do with the United States nor this conversation, but I'll use it as an example, which is the EU-Mercosur agreement. Why there are so many people against the agreement when this agreement would be transformational and would change everything in the relationship between the two regions? I think that there is an issue of perception. I use this example, and it applies to the OECD. The arguments that are used, for example, of excluding Brazil from participating in the Environment Committee of the OECD makes no sense. So it's good because it brings me back to the beginning. People are listening to the noise and are looking at the ball. If people stopped and thought about this, it would make a lot of sense. But I didn't answer your question, but you gave me an opportunity to say something that I always like to say. Thank you.
It's an important point. Thank you very much. As we said, getting beyond the noise canceling, putting on the noise canceling headphones, as you said so well. And obviously, I think, count on us. I'm glad you also reminded us of the timing and the extent of the process, because but you can count on us. We helped Colombia through the process two and 3 years ago on the economic chapters. Count on us on that. But we also have the scars to prove it with all of with the timing challenges. Believe me, we do. So you both have been more than generous with your time and your thoughts. It's been a great discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much. We really, deeply appreciate your support and helping make this bilateral relationship go, and your collaboration that is par excellence with the private sector. So thank you both so much. And it is now my privilege to turn it over to my great colleague, Renata Vasconcelos, to finish it up.
Thanks, Neil. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And with that, we close the second edition of the U.S. Brazil Connect Summit. So we heard from both governments, from ambassadors, from executives and experts. We announced a new leadership of the Brazil Council in the U.S. and in Brazil, so welcome our leaders. We discuss issues of concern, ideas for course correction, positive developments, new partnerships in energy. For example, the express delivery issue is a great news for us, for the Council. We've been working on that for a long time. The concerns over climate are genuine, but I think we also have to recognize that the US-Brazil bilateral trade is rich as it was said here, of high value and very much essential for the recovery of both countries, right? So we heard that a lot of times today. A year ago, the two governments announced the signature of the trade protocol. Just yesterday, it passed the lower house of the Brazilian Congress. We'll continue to push for speed approval. So we are the private sector. We'll continue to aim high and make it happen. So with that, I have to thank all my colleagues. I have to thank my team at U.S. Chamber, and hope to see you again next year in person at the U.S. Chamber building, hopefully everyone together in person. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.